What's up, everybody? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. I'm your host, Ricardo Varandas. I figured I'd say the Portuguese Latin way because today we talk about a lot of Latin people and mostly Cuba, and figured I just keep with the theme. And today we have Lamar Waldron, who is a historian. He's very well known for his knowledge on the JFK assassination and the history in regards to the JFK assassination. It's a very interesting topic. It's one subject that I absolutely love talking about. I'm sure you guys have probably listened to some of my past shows, which we dibble dabble in the JFK assassination, like my show with Russ Baker, who wrote the book Family Secrets, which talks about the JFK assassination. Jesse Ventura's been on, talk about the JFK assassination in his book. And then also Abraham Bolden, who wrote the book Echoes from Daley Plaza, and Roger Stone wrote the book The Man Who Killed Kennedy, the case against LBJ. And the cool thing is Lamar and I kind of talk about those other books because I've had those guests on. I was kind of curious on their theories compared to his theories and where they agree and where they disagree. So I kind of talk about those other guests and the theories in their books, and kind of just curious what Lamar had to say. So it really made for an interesting conversation because it's always fun to kind of talk to somebody who's so knowledgeable about the topic and really just get his opinion. And I don't think we agree on everything, but I think that he is, without a doubt, I mean, you can't really argue that he's very well researched and really knows his shit and has names and dates and everything to back up his theories and opinions. And so it's hard to argue with him, but makes for a really interesting conversation. And this topic, I think, is so important because I think it was a September 11th before there was September 11th. And what I mean by that is it was an event that changed history, the course of history. It changed almost everything that happened afterwards. And the JFK assassination, I think, when you really research it and you look into who was a part of it, who was possibly responsible for it, and you realize when people are capable of that for other incentives and for other reasons, and when I say that, I mean to assassinate a president of the United States, a democratically elected official of the United States, in front of everybody during the day, it's pretty insane. So I think it's just a really important event. And I think when you look into that, I think we talked about this when Jesse Ventura was on, just the idea that when you realize that if people are capable of that for money, for power, for geopolitical reasons, then for foreign policy, then they're capable in anything. And I think that's a really scary thing. And September 11th, same thing, and I think history changed after that event. So I think that's why this topic and subject never seems to go away, and I hope it doesn't. And I hope even younger people go online and they research it, watch Oliver Stone's JFK movie. And I know some people say that it's not always accurate and historically isn't on point, but it'll spark thinking. It'll spark hopefully you researching it yourself, and it sparks this whole conversation again about the JFK assassination. I think that's very important. So Lamar, very interesting. Like I said, we talk about a lot of other theories, and we talk a lot about his own theories, but then we bounce other theories off him and kind of get his perspective. And he also puts out there that if anybody has any questions based on his book or something that you feel like is inconsistent or something he doesn't question, he'll be more than happy to come back on and answer that. So definitely listen to the show, comment on it on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, RV36, where you can find the video versions of all our episodes. He does call in only using audio this time, so you can't visually see us talk like you can with most of our guests who call in using video, but you can listen to it also on YouTube. And in the comments, tell us your opinion, or hit me up on our Ripple Effect Podcast Facebook page and throw me some questions, or email me at rv36@aol.com. Well, I think that's it for now. Thanks again, guys. Subscribe to us on YouTube. Find us on Facebook and like us there. Follow me on Twitter at rv36. And I'm always sharing articles, videos, documentaries, anything that I find interesting. So I won't fill up your feed with a bunch of nonsense. And I think that's it for now. So thanks again, guys. Really appreciate it. And I'll see you on the next one. Peace.
Great to be with you.
I know you got a weird schedule, so I'm glad I could do it a little later. I used to do shows at much weirder times because today was just hard because I was watching my son most of the day. But yeah, I've done shows at 11 o'clock at night, 12 o'clock at night. When you're doing podcasts with people all over the world, sometimes people are on some weird schedules. But you're located in America, so you just stay up writing, or what's your story?
Yeah, I mean, I guess from writing, I've written those 4 pretty large books. I guess three gigantic and 1 large, and I guess from working 2 or 3 days in a row without sleeping and no caffeine or anything else to keep me awake, you sort of get out of the normal rhythm, so to speak. So yeah, I wind up writing late at night to the wee hours of the morning, which there are very few distractions at that time. So
Yeah, well, I completely understand because I do construction for a living. We have a family-owned company, and in winter we slow down. And with the podcast, and I also do music. I write my own music and produce it and stuff like that. And I always seem to do my best work late at night. And same thing. I would be up till 6, 7 in the morning, 8 in the morning, and then it would mess up my whole sleeping schedule. Now with having a son, I have an 11-month-old, so now I work around his schedule. But before, when he wasn't around, it's same thing. I found that at night, I don't know, it was just easier to concentrate because, like you said, the lack of distractions, the lack of having your phone going off, checking your email, even social media. There's less going on social media, so there's less things to distract you. So I found it much easier to just concentrate and just pay attention to my work and focus in. So yeah, I definitely had the same problem.
Well, and again, I appreciate you doing this schedule too, because yeah, this is working out perfect for me, because after we finish, I'll run out and do a little last-minute grocery shopping, and then we're supposedly going to be snowed in tonight. So,
are you in the East Coast?
Yeah, I'm in the northern suburbs of Atlanta.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm from Massachusetts. I'm a little town a little outside of Springfield, Mass, called Ludlow. So yeah. Well,
so snow is nothing unusual for you guys.
Yeah, we see it all the time. It's actually this year has been kind of weird because we haven't got as much as I'm used to seeing by now. So it's I don't know if we're gonna have a mild winter, or the big stuff still hasn't hit us yet. If there's still some big storms that are coming that we just haven't seen yet. So
you may get something out of this storm. They're saying 2 feet of snow for Washington D.C., which usually doesn't get 2 feet of snow in a whole season, I don't think.
Yeah.
But let's hope it's not too bad for you guys.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Like you said, being from New England, you're kind of used to it, so it's just snow doesn't really affect us. We just kind of go on with our everyday lives. Like I know.
Here everything comes to a screeching halt when there's even a dusting of snow.
Yeah, I hear that. Even like I have a buddy who's from San Antonio. He said the same thing. He's like, if you get any rain or anything crazy, a little wild, people just panic and don't know how to drive, and it's pretty insane. It's different part. It's weird how you become immune to certain things. You get used to certain things, and what seems hazardous in certain states, in your state, it's just completely normal, and you go on with your everyday life.
Yeah, here it's going to be interesting to see what happens tonight. But anyway, like I said, glad we can talk, and happy to do your show, and looking forward to talking about a lot of interesting stuff.
Yeah, let's get right into it. So, how did you get involved in the JFK history? Because it seems like it's one of those things where I am very surprised that I meet people my age, or mostly younger, that haven't seen the Zapruder film. I mean, I've shown people like nephews and cousins that are young, and I'm like, do you realize that this video of the President of the United States of America getting shot in the head is on YouTube? And they're like, no, it's not. I'm like, yeah. I'm like, you haven't seen it? And it's amazing to me how many people kind of know the rough outline of the events and what happened, that there's possibly a conspiracy that happened and the president got shot, but how little they actually know about the specifics. And I think it's awesome when people like yourself continuously talk about it and put out books, and because I think it's such an important part of history. And I think that for similar to September 11th, the whole world changed afterwards. So what spawned your interest in it, and what got you, for lack of a better word, obsessed with this story and this historical event?
Well, it goes back, in my case, more than 25 years. And by the way, something I hope we can touch on today, too, is one reason a lot of young people don't know a lot about the assassination, a disturbing trend I've noticed over the last several years, especially the last couple of years, is there are historians, mainstream historians, or even people on the conspiracy side who believe that evidence, which is something Congress concluded back in 1979, something most people don't even realize, that, yes, Congress did a huge investigation of this in the late 70s, and even though the FBI, CIA, and Naval Intelligence withheld a lot of important information from them, they did get a lot of information, and they concluded it was a conspiracy. But a lot of current writers leave out a lot of that information, which is just stunning. So someone can read a book about the Kennedy assassination or related areas about, say, Richard Nixon and some of his crimes, and they come away knowing nothing about, these really important things that were front page news, not for just days or weeks, but in some cases for years. But I was, I really didn't, have the option to kind of ignore these things, because I did grow up in the era when Kennedy was assassinated. And, so I was, in elementary school back in '63, and I remember the whole thing. Someone comes into the schoolroom and says Kennedy's been shot, and someone, I think there was one TV in the elementary school, and that was turned on, and there was all this news, and everybody was in shock, and it was just stunning. And then I do remember, I have to confess, I was playing hooky from church on Sunday morning, because there had been nothing but JFK since the assassination, basically on all three networks, and that's all there was then, was all three networks plus a very small PBS. And they had started showing the local program, at least on one of the stations, on Sunday morning, and I wanted to stay home and watch cartoons, so I kind of pretended to be sick, and it was probably one of the first times my parents left me by myself. I would have been, I guess, around 8 years old or so by then. And, they were just going to go to Sunday school and come right back. And, I had a wonderful mom and father. And, and I admit it, I was just totally faking, because I was just so tired. I hadn't been able to watch any of the shows I wanted because there was nothing but JFK. So I'm at home alone. They think I'm in bed. I'm, of course, in the living room watching cartoons. And they're all at church, and then the news comes on, and I'm like, oh darn, this is more news. I want my cartoons, and they're showing the transfer of Oswald, and they went live for that, and so I'm sitting at home alone, 8 years old, watching this on television unfold, and then suddenly some guy comes out of the crowd and shoots this Oswald guy on live television, and I'm just like stunned. I'm like, and there's no adult to say, don't worry, this will be okay, or this isn't what it looks like, because it sure looked like some guy was just shooting him right in the police station. And even at 8 years old, I knew people don't get shot in police stations. You might get shot, if a robber's robbing a bank or something like that, or, some crook has Lois Lane trapped and Superman's going to come save her, but no, this was news, and it was live, and you could tell all the adults were just in shock and didn't know what to say or what to think. So that kind of stuck with me, but frankly, otherwise, until 1988 and the 25th anniversary of the assassination, I had no more interest in these events than any other well-informed person. And it was really the news around the 25th anniversary. I mean, I had been vaguely aware there was some sort of congressional investigation in the 70s, but it was not really a big topic for me. I had other things. I was running an outpatient treatment center for juvenile offenders and their families for the state of Georgia. I was pursuing a career at the same time, writing a science fiction graphic novel. So I had, my plate was like really full. But around the 25th anniversary in 1988, there were a lot of mainstream articles. I mean, in places like the New York Times that avoid this topic today, who were basically saying, JFK was probably killed by a conspiracy, again echoing what Congress had concluded almost 10 years earlier, and that the Mafia had something to do with it, if not everything. And then there was a special by a famous reporter at the time named Jack Anderson. There's really no one in the news business today who is like Jack Anderson. I mean, we have news readers on television, which is what they call them in Europe, and what unfortunately most of our anchors in America should be called. They're news readers. They're reading copy someone else wrote, and they're responding to a producer in their earpiece. But Jack Anderson was what was called a muckraking journalist at the time. He took over a widely syndicated Washington column started by Drew Pearson, probably one of the most respected newsmen in America in the 50s and early 60s. And then when Drew Pearson passed away, Jack Anderson took over his column. He reported a lot of things that nobody else would report. Things about the CIA hiring the Mafia to kill Fidel Castro. He was writing about that in 1967, and this was appearing in many major American papers because his column was in many major American newspapers, but no other newspaper or TV station anywhere would talk about that, even though he had written about it twice in 67. It had shown up in hundreds of papers, and as we learned later, that's because the CIA had people kind of riding herd on the news, one of whom was a guy that later became famous in Watergate, a very high-level CIA supervisor by the name of E. Howard Hunt. But Hunt was one of several CIA people that dealt with the media, dealt with the newspapers, and so it was pretty clear, any newspaper that tried to follow up Jack Anderson's work in the late 60s and even early 70s was quickly shut down. Well, eventually, Watergate couldn't continue that trend, and of course, E. Howard Hunt, one of the CIA's media liaisons, was then involved. So during Watergate and really just before, Jack Anderson had become huge. He was really way ahead of Woodward and Bernstein on many of the crimes of Richard Nixon. So by 1988, he still had a pretty good reputation, and he did a television special, very high budget. And this was, distinguished journalist, had recreations, and it basically outlined how several powerful mob bosses had been involved with Kennedy's murder. They interviewed a lot of witnesses on camera, just amazing stuff. The guy who owned the sleazy club in Fort Worth, where a lot of Kennedy's Secret Service agents were partying until the wee hours of the morning, in some cases just a few hours before they had to be protecting JFK. The doctor who treated the woman who was a heroin runner for the Louisiana-Texas Mafia, who had told a doctor before JFK was shot that JFK was going to be killed. So they had great witnesses, great recreations, and it all seemed like everything was about to come out. But then at the end of that Jack Anderson documentary, they said that there were, I think it was like hundreds of pages of JFK files that were still secret, maybe even 1,000 or two. And that boggled my mind. My friend Tom Hartman, who's now a radio and TV commentator.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan. Yeah, I watch The Big Picture quite often. I've seen you on there recently.
Oh, okay, great. And Tom's a super guy. We were working together on a corporate communications company at the time, and also pursuing our writing avocation. And we were stunned. Wow, there could be 1,000 or 2,000 pages of JFK files still secret after 25 years. Why keep them secret? And so Tom and I actually set about to write a novel, because I was writing graphic novels at the time. Tom was writing detective fiction. Let's write a novel about these events, and I'll just research things for a few weeks, so I'll know the basics, and then we could write our novel. Well, what happened was we were lucky. JFK's Secretary of State lived just 90 minutes from Atlanta. He had retired to Athens, Georgia. That was Secretary of State Dean Rusk, a guy I'd seen on TV growing up in the 60s and early 70s, and one of the, frankly, the architects of the Vietnam War. And we were like, well, let's talk to this guy. We'd uncovered a Washington Post article that talked about JFK's plans for a second invasion of Cuba in the fall of 1963. And I was always pretty good at history, but I'd never heard of plans for a second invasion of Cuba around the time JFK was killed. In fact, Cuba wasn't even in the news around the time JFK was killed. A year earlier, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we all thought we were going to get blown up. But a year after that, no. The Kennedys were going out of their way to keep Cuba off the front page and out of the news. So that was odd. So, we were going to interview Rusk for Georgia Public Television for part of a newsletter we were doing, and he was going to give his oral reminiscences on television. And I read his kind of an autobiography he did, and this was a guy who had all of his answers well rehearsed. He was a former Secretary of State, ultimate diplomat. And he would say the same stories on television. He said in his book almost word for word. And the first part of my interview was word for me. You talk to this guy about Vietnam, and he has his rationalizations and excuses, and but that was kind of boring because he was saying exactly what he said in his book and exactly what he was saying on these recorded interviews that were going to broadcast, that we were publicizing. And then at the end of that part of the interview, I said, well, Mr. Rusk, my associate and I, Tom Hartman, we're working on a novel set during 1963, and I just read in the Washington Post in the obituary for this Cuban exile that there were plans for a second invasion of Cuba in the fall of '63. And he basically said, nobody's ever asked me about that. I haven't talked about these things since '63, early '64, and he became a totally different person, no longer giving these, well-rehearsed answers and sound bites, but was talking much more freely. Luckily, my master's degree is in counseling and psychology, so I'm used to drawing people out to talk about things that they aren't used to talking about or that can be uncomfortable. So, and when we were just, we weren't journalists really at that time. We were, just wanting background for this novel we were going to write. So, it's not like he thought anything he told us was going to be on the news the next day. But he's still cautious, former Secretary of State. But he said, yep. There were plans when JFK passed away. They were imminent. They were days away from happening. There was going to be a kind of second invasion of Cuba. He stressed it was nothing like what had been planned for the Bay of Pigs, nothing like what the U.S. almost did during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when it looked like we might have to take out those Russian missiles if Russia had not backed down. And I said, well, wait, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, everyone knows that JFK promised not to invade Cuba. So how was this going to happen? Was he going to go back on his word? And he told me then. And Russell was even though he was in Athens, Georgia, a small town where the University of Georgia is, he clearly kept up with world events, and and he no doubt had sources in the government that were still friendly to him. And as I learned later, I think he was well aware that files were being declassified right then about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because there was a whole book full of them about to come out. And he said, no, that pledge never took effect. Never took effect. That was contingent on Fidel Castro, the head of Cuba, allowing UN inspections for the weapons of mass destruction, the nuclear weapons in Cuba, to be sure they had all been removed. Castro would never allow those inspections because the deal had been struck between JFK and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev without consulting Castro. When Castro found out, he was livid, and he refused to allow the UN weapons inspectors into Cuba. So JFK's pledge, as Russ told me, and then documents that came out later that year verified. And as many, now I've been fighting this battle for many years to make sure people know that. And now, luckily, even in, I think the last PBS documentary I saw, they don't exactly say there was a pledge. Because, it was even front page news. It was New York Times headline, that it was basically, part of that deal was Castro has to allow the UN weapons inspections. It didn't happen. JFK did not make a big issue of it. He wanted to get this off the front pages in the fall of '62, because we were all just thought we were minutes away from nuclear destruction. And in the fall of '62, we were hiding under our desk, going into the bomb shelter for an hour or two each day at school so we wouldn't be scared when we really had to go when the bombs started falling. So a year later, in the fall of '63, JFK wanted this as far from the front pages as possible. But it turns out they were making all these secret plans for a kind of invasion of Cuba. I have to say, at the time, this was so new to me, it was very difficult for me to understand what Russ was talking about, because he said it wasn't, exactly a full-scale military invasion, like D-Day or Pearl Harbor, but yet it wasn't like the Bay of Pigs. It would be years later before I would kind of work with a government investigating committee to get some of these files released, that we found out exactly what it was. But he did keep stressing Pearl Harbor. He said, you got to keep Pearl Harbor in mind with this, and I frankly did not understand what he meant. I found out later two important things. Actually, three important things. One was that JFK was at Naval Intelligence Headquarters when Pearl Harbor happened. Rusk told me then, and I read more later, that he was, even though he was in the Army, he was assigned to Naval Intelligence Headquarters as like a liaison. And basically when Pearl Harbor happened, the U.S. had lost part of the Japanese fleet. The minute Pearl Harbor happened, the admirals there ordered the men to start destroying all the files. And Rusk witnessed that. And so as Rusk was trying to explain to me why there was still so much secrecy about JFK's assassination, and especially the second invasion, he kept evoking Pearl Harbor. So that was one thing he meant was, so after Pearl Harbor, all those files got, destroyed that showed what had really happened there. And, JFK was part of that. And then those men who destroyed those files were kind of spread to the four winds. JFK was assigned down to South Carolina. Other people were just, thrown all over the country so that Congress could never really get their fingers around that. Also, JFK was killed November 22nd, 1963. Pearl Harbor Day was December 7th, 1963. As I learned later from the files, and Russ kind of implied, that was a big factor. The U.S. did not want to be seen at all of attacking or bombing another country around the Pearl Harbor anniversary of December 7th, because think how that would look. People around the world, and Kennedy did care very much what people around the world thought. He was beloved in most places around the world. They did not want to be seen staging a Pearl Harbor attack on Cuba around that December 7th anniversary. Hence, that's why this invasion had to occur well before then. And Russ kept stressing to me it was shortly after JFK's Dallas trip when this was going to happen. Later on, I was able to find CIA files and talk to other sources who worked with the Kennedys that confirmed the date of December 1st, 1963. So basically 10 days or so, 9 or 10 days after Dallas was when the U.S. was going to invade Cuba. But it was going to be a kind of invited invasion. Rusk implied that someone high in the Cuban government, very high, was working with the United States. I threw out one name to him, a guy by the name of Rolando Cubela, the CIA had admitted working with to try to assassinate Castro. Russ laughed at that. He said, no, Cubela was like, small fry, small fish. No, we were working with one of the top people in Cuba. He didn't give me a name, and I didn't press him because, I was getting so much stuff now, it was hard for me to wrap my head around it. But Rusk turned out to be the first of more than 24 people who worked very closely with John or Robert Kennedy on various aspects of that plan and related plans, who eventually gave Tom and I the full story. And then, like I said, I provided information to a government committee set up in the wake of the Oliver Stone film to finally release all those JFK files. And guess what? Turns out there weren't 1,000 or 2,000 pages of JFK files still secret at the 25th anniversary. There were over 4.5 million pages, actually close to 5 million pages. The government did release 4.5 million pages, but according to NBC News, there are 1 million CIA records alone that were not released related to the JFK assassination, even though the law passed unanimously by Congress in 1992 required it. So basically what was for me going to be, and Tom, a few-week effort to talk to some people, one thing led to another, led to more Kennedy people, and the next thing 20 years have gone by, and I'm starting to write my books, and enough people have died, and by the early 90s, we had discovered so much, including the identity of the number 3 guy in Cuba who was working with John and Robert Kennedy to basically stage a coup against Fidel Castro on December 1st, 1963. That the book became nonfiction. That guy actually, Juan Almeida, the head of the Cuban Army, the founder of the Cuban Army, much more powerful in Cuba in '63 than someone like Che Guevara. I mean, Commander Almeida had saved Che Guevara's life in the first battle of the revolution. So we're talking somebody who's like the George Washington and General Eisenhower of Cuba. The highest black official in Cuba, which is very important because Cuba is 70% of African descent. And of course, Fidel is white, Raul is white, Che Guevara was not even Cuban. And so Commander Almeida was a very highly respected, revered figure in Cuba. He disappeared for a while in the early 90s. Just disappeared the way people did in communist countries in those days. And that's one reason I think a lot of people, including Rusk, were so forthcoming, because this guy whose identity and work for the Kennedys had to be protected for so long, he was assumed to be dead by several of the people we talked to. He resurfaced in the mid-90s. That left Tom and I in a difficult position. Tom went on to his great radio TV career. I kind of stuck with the research, and then finally wrote a book in 2005 leaving out Commander Almeida's name and any information that could identify him. The week before that book came out in 2005, I got the first official letter from the U.S. government saying that Almeida's identity was officially being declassified, had been declassified. So then I got to rewrite that book over the next year, putting in all the information about Commander Almeida, including his name, his entire background, that I had to leave out of the first edition of the book. And then everything has kind of followed since then. So the bottom line is the secrecy around JFK's assassination today and at the time was largely not to protect the killers, because Robert Kennedy was one of the people withholding a lot of information, including attempts that were made on JFK's life that were planned for Chicago and in Tampa in the weeks before JFK's murder in Dallas. But it was to protect the number 3 guy in Cuba who was secretly working for us, America, and remained unexposed and in power until the late 80s. And then, like I say, he disappeared. It was assumed Castro had finally found out, but then he reappeared in the mid-90s. He's dead now. But so that's the root of the secrecy. But it turns out the CIA and the FBI and naval intelligence used that national security excuse to hide a lot of their own intelligence failures, and in the case of the CIA, the active involvement of at least a couple, and probably 3 or 4 CIA people in JFK's murder. And those million CIA records that NBC reported were still secret back in 1998, they're not only still secret today, but the National Archives refuses to say how many pages of JFK records are still secret to this very day, or how many thousands of feet of undercover audio tape are still secret, because most of your listeners will not know that the FBI got the confession of America's most powerful godfather, the man who basically ran Louisiana and most of Texas, Carlos Marcello. The FBI got his confession in 1987 through an undercover informant. And then after getting his JFK confession, they recorded hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of undercover audio tape of Marcello talking about his crimes, including parts of JFK's murder and Oswald and Ruby and all this stuff. And the FBI has never, ever released, 1 second of those audio tapes, even though that 1992 JFK Act requires that. So there's a tremendous amount of information that's still being withheld illegally by the CIA, by the FBI, by naval intelligence. And like I say, the National Archives, even though this law requires all those records to have been released in the 90s, they won't even say how many records they're still withholding, because my belief is, and I think the evidence shows, that number would be so high that Americans would just be shocked. We had the 50th anniversary of JFK's murder, and they would say, what on earth are we doing withholding, 1 million CIA records alone, plus FBI, plus naval intelligence? What's the big secret after 50 years? And I can tell you, there is no longer a big secret. There's that national security excuse that now that relations are being normalized with Cuba, there's no legitimate reason to keep those records secret today. So one of my 2 current quests in life is to get those records released, and at least to let the American public know, including these people you've talked about, young people that don't even realize you can see JFK's murder, in high definition on YouTube. But those people certainly don't realize there's still over 1 million CIA records alone that's still secret about his assassination, despite the law that requires their release. So that's something I'm trying to bring as much attention to as I can, which is why I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak with you today.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's amazing how many different roads you can go down with this JFK assassination. From the mob links to the Cuban links to I had Abraham Bolden on, who wrote Echoes from Dealey Plaza. You briefly talked about
a great patriot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was very happy to have him on. I mean, the guy is a historic figure, and to have him on to talk about the Chicago plot, which he wanted to testify for an warrant commission about. But yeah, the Cuba thing is interesting because a lot of people don't realize the importance of the link to the JFK assassination between Cuba and the assassination. And I mean, Fidel, obviously he made a lot of enemies because after the revolution, he nationalized the oil refineries. He took over, I believe, the U.S. telephone companies. He forced reductions in electric companies. He did a bunch of stuff to piss off business owners, and also Havana, Cuba, which a lot of mobsters were making money with the casinos and stuff like that. And I think that part of the story is important because to understand how many people he angered, and obviously his relationship with LBJ wasn't very good either. I had Roger Stone on, who I think last year I had him on to talk about his book. I had him on recently, but before I had him to talk about his book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ, which is, again, who has more incentive than the guy who becomes president without ever having to win an election, and that's LBJ, and he has a crooked past too. And so there's so many different avenues, and obviously Oswald's, Lee Harvey Oswald's story, and was he working for the CIA and all this stuff. So I mean, where do you start if you're a new listener or new to this story and you want to get into the JFK assassination? Where do you start? What do you think is the most important first couple steps? Is it you have to learn about the Cuba incidents, Northwoods and Bay of Pigs and that stuff, and then, is that one of the most important pieces to the whole puzzle?
Well, you raise some interesting points there, and people should know a few things. One is, when Castro took over, with the revolution and everything, most people think it was Castro. Castro was one of several major leaders. The others all got kind of pushed out. I mean, Castro was not even the first president of the Cuba after the revolution, but it was seeing those other leaders get pushed out one at a time or killed that is what prompted Commander Almeida by 1963 to feel that Castro had betrayed the revolution and was becoming nothing more than a dictator. Commander Almeida and all the other revolutionaries had worked hard to overthrow the dictator of Cuba.
Batista.
Almeida did not want to see another one. And Almeida, Fidel, they weren't communist when the revolution happened. There was a communist party in Cuba. They weren't part of it. But, since the U.S. wasn't giving Castro help, he certainly turned to the Soviet Union. So, and another thing, too, people think, Castro took over and he shut down the casinos, which is true, but they needed that revenue, so they reopened those casinos again. And the guy who was the liaison handling the payoffs that used to go to Batista, the former Cuban dictator's pockets, now went to the Cuban government and to Fidel. And the guy who was a liaison between the Mafia and the Cuban government in 1959, right after the revolution, was a guy by the name of Frank Fiorini, a low-level mobster, who also worked for the CIA during the revolution. And he later changed his name to Frank Sturgis during Watergate. And so, the mob still had a presence in Cuba for quite some time. The last casino was not shut down until many months after the Bay of Pigs. So people don't realize, they have a very narrow view and often inaccurate view of Cuba and the Mafia and that sort of thing. But I can tell you what Tom and I did, and then I'll tell you exactly the best place for people to start if they want to learn more about the JFK assassination. We started with no preconceptions, and we looked at every suspect. I have to say, when Tom and I began investigating back in late 1988, if it had turned out that Richard Nixon or George Bush had been responsible, or that Oswald had acted alone but that the Mafia had hired him, or that some big U.S. general had killed JFK, we were open to all those possibilities. We were looking for the best fictional take, but we wanted it based on fact. So we looked at every suspect. I mean, we looked, we were not big fans of Richard Nixon or George Bush, Sr. We looked really, really, really hard at those guys, thinking we would find something. But of course, we found nothing. A lot of people, I'll give you an example, think, LBJ must have been it. I mean, he became president, it took place in Texas. But then when you find out that the first plan to kill JFK, and there wasn't multiple plans, there was one plan that could be implemented almost identically in three cities. The first place he was supposed to be shot from a high building overlooking the motorcade route was Chicago, November 1st. And JFK and the Secret Service, they found out about that attempt. An ex-Marine with a lot of parallels to Oswald did get arrested. He was clearly going to be the patsy. He worked at a warehouse overlooking the motorcade route. He had weapons when he was arrested the morning of the canceled motorcade. JFK did just cancel his motorcade in Chicago for security reasons. As his press secretary, Pierre Salinger, told me, the poor guy had to put out like 2 different phony excuses in less than an hour to cover up why they were really canceling not just the motorcade, but JFK's entire trip to Chicago. And so, and then 4 days before Dallas, JFK's longest domestic motorcade in Tampa, Florida, the threat flared up again. And I talked to the Tampa chief of police, who said he'd been waiting for someone to talk to him about this since 1963. And there was a big plot to kill JFK, and the authorities found out about it, and there were at least 2 people involved. There was a patsy with even more similarities to Oswald, who did by reports, go to Dallas. And so when you start realizing, JFK was only killed in Dallas because things had not worked out in Chicago or Tampa, and of course LBJ, sure, he was a power in Texas, but he was, he had no special clout in Chicago or Tampa. And I was surprised to learn this. LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, was so unpopular in Dallas by the early 60s because he was in favor of civil rights, that he and his wife were attacked in the lobby of Dallas's nicest hotel during the 1960 campaign. In other words, there were parts of Texas where LBJ was popular. Dallas was not one of them. Dallas was very reactionary, super conservative, and some of the leading citizens of Dallas literally cornered LBJ and his wife Lady Bird in the lobby of Dallas's finest hotel. And these were, your well-to-do upper-class citizens, but they hated the powers that be in Dallas. They hated Lyndon Johnson. So, and think about this too. I mean, at least one, if not two shots came from behind JFK's limousine. The last shot to hit JFK actually literally flew over Lyndon Johnson's head. If anybody had been jostled firing that shot from the area of the school book depository, Lyndon Johnson would have been killed. Nobody is going to. So not only is there no evidence that Lyndon Johnson, and believe me, Tom and I we looked hard because we thought we might find something, but we looked hard for years. Not only is there no evidence that Lyndon Johnson had anything to do with JFK's murder, not in Dallas, not in Chicago, not in Tampa, but, if you're setting up to kill somebody, you're not going to have the last shot fly just feet above your head. I mean, that's just ridiculous.
Well, I think Roger Stone's, some of his debate, it's been a long time since I've looked through his, his theories and his book, but I know he talked about, his, the Bobby Baker scandal, and then he talked about his links to, I forgot what it was called, but it was Hollenburn before it was Hollenburn, something in Brown, and also, Hoover being good friends of his, and him knowing.
Well, but here's what we have to remember, because I know there are people, and you probably have listeners, who think shadowy generals killed JFK, like Oliver Stone showed, or Lyndon Johnson killed JFK, or J. Edgar Hoover killed JFK. But when you look at things, and this is what I tried to do in my most recent book, because I have to admit, my first two books on the assassination, they're like 900 pages, 2,000 endnotes. They're really intended for the really, knowledgeable person, or the person who wants to become really knowledgeable. I mean, they are documented out the wazoo. They cover every aspect.
Yeah, they're a little intimidating.
Right. So that's why I wrote my last book on the JFK assassination, The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination. It's only 500 pages. There are no endnotes, because with Google now, you really don't need endnotes. If I quote a file or a person, you can Google that quote, and you can find out exactly where it came from. If nothing else, it'll show up referred back to one of my two other books. And so that is really, and I hate to sound immodest, I wrote that book because there were different people that would cover the Cuba aspect, the Mafia aspect, the political aspect, or would try to blame other people even though there was no evidence. And so I wrote The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination, for the new reader. I basically tell you exactly who killed JFK and why in chapter 1, and I put in I use my graphic novel experience to construct a photo document section that really, it's almost like a mini documentary that really gives you, the high level view of exactly what happened and why, and then the rest of the book, fills in everything. But I can give you, you mentioned LBJ, you mentioned Hoover. Most people think, Hoover hated Bobby Kennedy. That's true. JFK had a personal failing. He wasn't perfect, and his personal failing was women. And again, that's like a lot of wealthy men in America, especially
Martin Luther King had the same problem, and
Well, I think you could probably, if you took the 50 richest Republicans in America, I would be shocked if 90% of them didn't have the same problem too. It's just that, in a certain era, like if you go back to the 1950s, even 1959, and 60, when you look at the Oscar-winning pictures for those years, The Apartment and Gigi, it was just assumed that wealthy, powerful men had mistresses. And in countries like France today, that's just an assumption. In America, we like to pretend that's not the case. But in JFK's case, he did have various mistresses and girlfriends and liaisons, and Dean Rusk even told me about one. But
one that wasn't there also a mysterious death to one, because one was the wife of a CIA officer or agent, right, I believe.
And that was later, but again, when you look at and she was good friends with Ben Bradley, the Washington Post editor, and I know Tom and I looked at that. We said, oh, so the CIA killed Kennedy because Kennedy was having an affair with the ex-wife of a CIA officer, but they had gotten divorced, I think, before JFK even became president, or around the time he did, and then. Frankly, again, in Washington circles at that time, with what we know now about who was sleeping with whom, I mean, JFK was not an exception. I mean, even people we don't think of in that light, like Gerald Ford, you think super straight-laced guy. No, he was getting women from Bobby Baker as well. And we'll explain in a minute who that is. But J. Edgar Hoover knew about those affairs. He knew about them. And there was one with an East German woman, especially, in October of '63. Hoover was facing the mandatory retirement age. He could have been forced to retire, except Hoover had the dirt on everybody. No one knew at the time Hoover himself was gay and in the closet, even though he persecuted gays mercilessly. And so Hoover had struck a deal with JFK to keep the mistresses out of the press, and especially that East German one. And so Hoover's job was totally secure. Bobby Baker was kind of Lyndon Johnson's fixer on the Hill, on Capitol Hill. Lyndon Johnson, had been a very powerful member of Congress, and these people have these guys that do things for them. One of Baker's roles was providing women to people. To politicians, and Gerald Ford's among that group, and lots of others. And so people say, well, JFK was killed because there was an investigation into Bobby Baker that would have exposed LBJ's corruption, so LBJ had to kill JFK. So even though there's zero evidence that LBJ had anything to do with JFK's murder, he must have been responsible. But the problem is this: Bobby Baker did provide women to both Republicans and Democrats, to people like Gerald Ford, that rising, congressman from Michigan. And so what happened in the weeks after JFK died, nobody in Congress, none of the leadership, wanted any of that Bobby Baker woman stuff to come out. So the investigation was basically very truncated, and it focused on Baker. But so nobody had to kill JFK to hide the fact that Bobby Baker was providing JFK and Republican leaders in Congress with women. That nobody was going to let that come out. So like I say, so Hoover had no motivation, and Lyndon Johnson. People also say LBJ was going to be dumped from the ticket in 1964.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah,
you probably heard that.
Yeah.
But think why that doesn't wash. Where was JFK going when he was killed? What state was he in?
Texas.
He was in Texas. Who was the second most prominent person in his motorcade after JFK and Jackie Kennedy?
The governor, right?
It was Lyndon Johnson.
Oh, Lyndon Johnson. Yes.
Yeah. So in other words, if JFK were going to dump LBJ from the ticket in '64, which would basically cost him the election, because you cannot lose, you cannot go into an election without Texas. If you do, you're operating with one arm tied behind your back. And so if LBJ was going to be dumped from the ticket, they sure Dallas and Texas, and remember, it wasn't just Dallas. He went to Houston the night before. He went to Dallas, and he was going to another city. So you don't make a big show of public support for your vice president, then dump him the next week or the next month or 2 months. That would be a slap in the face to all of Texas, and JFK would no way have carried Texas.
But didn't you say that Lyndon Johnson actually wasn't as popular in Dallas as people thought he was?
Well, like I said, he was attacked in the lobby of Dallas's finest hotel. So, I mean, Lyndon Johnson did not. If Lyndon Johnson had wanted to kill JFK, and there's no credible evidence he did. Like I said, there's not a shred of evidence he had anything to do with JFK's murder. He didn't have the wherewithal to even pull that off, because I mean, he didn't. He wasn't buddies with the mayor. He wasn't buddies with the chief of police. I mean, he really. And he'd been a creature of Washington for a long time at that point, especially as vice president. So, I mean,
do you think
pull
he had
that
any
off in Dallas,
foreknowledge?
that's the last place he would have tried.
Do you think he had any foreknowledge that he might have known about it? I mean, because obviously his link with the mob and all the other links in his past. Do you think that it's possible that, because I mean, Roger Stone makes the case. He recently. I think he said it on my show, and he says in other interviews that there's a picture of him ducking before the first shot. And I definitely don't think that anybody believes that LBJ or any one person is specifically, or directly responsible alone, just was the head honcho who put this whole thing together. But it does seem like he would have incentive, and him and Kennedy obviously did not get along, and that's very well documented how they didn't get along. But I see what you mean. There's, besides all these theories, there's no real evidence pointing that he was a part of it.
Well, at least there's no real evidence. So I mean, now LBJ and Bobby didn't like each other. No doubt about that in the world. And I write about a really dramatic meeting in January of '64 relating to this Cuba stuff that really cemented the bitter feelings between those two men. But JFK and LBJ, I mean, there was no special, I mean, JFK was the ultimate politician. He realized that, there's no way he's carrying Texas and probably a lot of adjacent states unless he has LBJ. That's why he was in favor of having LBJ run as his vice president. So like I say, JFK and LBJ, they had no special, there was no real hatred there as there was between Bobby and Lyndon Johnson. But you made that point, though, which is just very true, that there is not a scintilla of evidence on the other side of the ledger. There is a mountain of credible evidence and credible confessions about the Mafia. Carlos Marcello, the godfather of Louisiana and Texas, Santo Trafficante, the godfather of Tampa, Florida, and Johnny Roselli, the Chicago Mafia's man in Hollywood and Las Vegas. And you'll notice, you got Roselli of the Chicago Mafia, Tampa, the godfather of Trafficante, the godfather of Tampa, Marcello, the godfather for Dallas and Louisiana. And so you've got your three cities. Each of those three gentlemen made what many historians consider to be very credible confessions. And I mean, not for money, not to publicity, only to very close associates, very late in life, with the expectation it would never be revealed. And then there's a mountain of supporting evidence for each of those gentlemen. So did LBJ take money from the Mafia? Sure. Did every politician in Louisiana and Texas that was successful take money from the Mafia? Yes, whether they knew it or not, because money was pretty dirty in those days. Remember, this is pre-Watergate, and the line between corporate America and the Mafia was very hazy then. So there were a lot of politicians who took money from the Mafia, good, liberal, progressive people. And they didn't even realize the money coming from this guy was actually from the Mafia. If the Mafia ever needed something, that was a string that could be pulled. But there's no credible evidence. Everything about LBJ's mistress, who the night before, all that has been thoroughly debunked. There was no meeting of LBJ and Hoover in Dallas the night before the assassination with Richard Nixon, as the story went. That's been debunked. Richard Nixon was very public in Dallas. Richard Nixon who had been the vice president, lost the 1960 election to Kennedy, then lost the governor's election in California, was an attorney for one of his clients was the Pepsi Cola company. And so there was a big soft drink bottlers convention in Dallas at the time of JFK's murder. Nixon was in Dallas, but he was seen out partying with all the top executives from Pepsi until the wee hours of the morning, and that was reported in the paper, not because of Nixon, but because the wife of the head of the Pepsi Cola company in those days was Joan Crawford, the Hollywood actress. So it was reported, in the newspapers that, when Nixon was supposedly having his secret meeting with LBJ and J. Edgar Hoover, Nixon was quite seen in public, and this was reported the next day because he was out with all these Pepsi executives and the Hollywood movie star Joan Crawford. So
was Bush there? I mean, that's another theory that you hear a lot is the link between Bush Sr. and I've had Russ Baker on, and he's talked about how he was in the CIA as early as late 50s, early 60s, and I have to say, aside from Russ Baker's Bush book, Russ Baker's written a lot of good stuff. I was disappointed in his Bush book because he seemed to want to blame the JFK assassination and Watergate all on George Bush, which takes. I did write one of my other books is The Hidden History of Watergate, and believe me, Nixon needs no one to take the blame. Nixon was one of the biggest criminals with the longest mafia ties, and 40 some odd members of his administration were indicted or convicted. I mean, Bush was a minor player in the Nixon White House. So Bush was not responsible for Watergate. That was all Richard Nixon to hide a lot of stuff that goes back to those CIA mafia plots to kill Fidel that Nixon hatched, not JFK. But and so I hate to summarize another author's work, but basically, and Tom and I, we looked into Bush hard. Sure, Bush had some intelligence connections in the early '60s, as did many business people operating in other countries. All the stuff you've heard about the ships being named this and that at the Bay of Pigs, that falls apart. That's just, you can just look it up on the internet. This is not true. It's very well documented, even by people who support a conspiracy. In other words, they're trying to paint that brush. And some people are saying, well, Bush must have been involved because he made sure he was publicly speaking at this event so people would see him. So he was clearly trying to establish an alibi. But wait a minute. Think about the rationale there. So that's what a lot of the people that say Bush was involved point to. So they're saying because he was, so public at the time of JFK's murder, he must have been establishing an alibi. But think what's the reverse of that? If he hadn't been in public, then these same people would say, well, no one knew where he was, so he must have been involved. So it's almost like if you start with the presumption that Bush was involved, you can find an excuse like the fact that he was giving to a speech to this business group, so he must be guilty because he was clearly establishing an alibi. But that makes no sense when you stop and think about it, because the reverse would be true too. So there are people that would love to blame the assassination on Bush. Again, there is not a shred of credible evidence that puts him there. So what we're faced with is a mountain of evidence with these three mob bosses, two godfathers and a mafia don, plus at least 3 CIA people, not the top guys at all. I mean, JFK had fired Allen Dulles, who's the subject of a recent biography by David Talbot that appears to try to blame the assassination on Allen Dulles. There's not a shred of evidence that Allen Dulles was involved, and he had been fired in 1961, more than 2 years before JFK's murder. He had no, Well, there's
role.
kind of two conspiracies. There's the conspiracy of the assassination and the conspiracy to cover it up. And I think Allen Dulles, it is kind of questionable him being put on the Warren Commission. And
But Bobby Kennedy was fine with that, and Bobby Kennedy himself. You'll notice, there's no mention of the Tampa attempt by Bobby Kennedy or anybody. Because remember, put yourself in this position, in Bobby's position. The number 3 guy in Cuba was ready to overthrow Fidel Castro on December 1st for the U.S. government. And here's an important aspect to that. Two very important aspects. One is the Mafia was completely banned from that operation as best as the Kennedys could do it. And the Mafia was banned from reopening their casinos in Cuba after that coup was successful. So the Mafia had nothing to gain by letting that coup go forward. It would do them no good. Plus, it was the only thing secret enough that could force high U.S. officials, including Robert Kennedy, to cover up crucial information in JFK's murder. So, when you start looking at it that way, and Commander Almeida, remember, he remained in power and unexposed for decades, and had indicated within weeks of JFK's murder he was still willing to go through with this coup. And in fact, Bobby Kennedy personally pleaded with his hated enemy, Lyndon Johnson, to go ahead with the coup. Lyndon Johnson had been left entirely out of the coup planning because he wasn't really an intimate of the Kennedys, and Robert Kennedy had been delegated by President Kennedy to run this coup operation. LBJ was not he said, because I talked to somebody, who dealt with all of that material, and Tom actually interviewed one of the people who was in that meeting with Bobby and LBJ. And LBJ said, I don't want another Bay of Pigs in the first few months of my administration. And I didn't know about these plans, and I don't know what's good, so we're shutting this down. But Commander Almeida, he potentially could have been used the next year, 5 years later, 10 years later. So that's the big secret. Alan Dulles, the former head of the CIA, sure, he covered up information from the Warren Commission, but so did Bobby Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy's own representative was fine with Alan Dulles being on the Warren Commission. In fact, most people don't realize. Many people would say, well, LBJ had Kennedy killed, and so he could go big in Vietnam and make all the money from Brown and Root and the other big contractors, and LBJ came up with the Warren Commission to hide all the information, which is just not true. It was the associates of Robert Kennedy that wanted the Warren Commission and were fine with Alan Dulles being on the Warren Commission because they did not trust J. Edgar Hoover to do a complete and thorough investigation. As it turns out, that was a well-founded fear. So, like I say, it was actually Robert Kennedy wanted the Warren Commission, and I have to say, Robert Kennedy, for the best of reasons, protecting the life of the number 3 guy in Cuba, our ally, withheld a lot of information from the Warren Commission. For instance, Warren Commission knew nothing about the Tampa attempt, and yet the Warren Commission did know about the Tampa suspect, Gilberto Policarpo Lopez, who had 24 parallels to Oswald. But if you know about a suspect in Tampa, but you don't know about the Tampa attempt, that doesn't do you a lot of good. But like I say, Bobby Kennedy covered up just as much, if not more, information from the Warren Commission as Alan Dulles.
But don't you think, from Bobby's Kennedy's perspective, isn't it interesting that don't you think he'd be more interested in getting out as much information as possible so those who are responsible can be exposed compared to hiding this information for other interests and other reasons?
Well, this is, you raise a very interesting point that I explore not only in my JFK books, but also in Watergate, The Hidden History. But this is laid out very clearly in The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination, because you're not the only person to have those questions. And I always love when people raise these points, because, there are answers for them, but many people can't get those answers. So there's simply... hang on 1 minute. Let me get a sip of water here.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, because it does seem, I've heard the same thing, that Robert Kennedy was also a part of withholding some information, but that just, not withholding some information, withholding incredibly crucial information, because just imagine, and I can imagine because I'm old enough, if the day after JFK's murder, so there was no publicity about the Tampa attempt at the time. Okay, John and Robert Kennedy were both, keep this out of the press. The day after the Tampa attempt,
the chief of police got a call from the Justice Department in Washington. It wasn't from Robert Kennedy, but it was somebody, working for Robert Kennedy, saying basically, we really appreciate you keeping every word about this attempt out of the press yesterday and for the foreseeable future. It was one of those thank you calls, but it's really an order from the Justice Department, at the behest of Robert Kennedy that, this stays super secret. But when JFK was killed in Dallas, in a situation very much like what they expected to happen in Tampa, the chief of police did talk to a reporter. In fact, there was a Secret Service file quoted in the Tampa Tribune the day after JFK was killed that the Secret Service has buried to this day. It's never been provided to any committee, and it's actually quoted. And the chief of police is saying, and there were at least 2 people, and we think they might have gone to Dallas, and so if that article had been picked up by the national press, and all of America knew that JFK was almost killed in Tampa 4 days earlier, that would have put a different spin on everything. Oswald not only didn't have a car, he couldn't even drive. And he's in Texas, and this is, that would have put a very different spin. So Robert Kennedy didn't just keep information from the Warren Commission, he kept the most critical information, things like the Tampa attempt, the Chicago attempt, the CIA Mafia plots to kill Fidel that were hatched by Richard Nixon. But here's the important point to answer your question. John and Robert Kennedy came to prominence by going after the Mafia. The reason that had to be the case was Richard Nixon had been supported by the Mafia since the start of his political career. I mean, the big L.A. gangster, Mickey Cohen, even wrote in his autobiography, I gave Nixon money from the start. So Nixon was mobbed up from the word go, from back in the 40s. And in the 1950s, the Mafia and their allies had the run not just of Havana, but pretty much most of America. I mean, Hoover was denying the Mafia even existed. And it wasn't just in places like New York and Chicago. There were dozens of medium-sized and large towns that were basically just controlled by the Mafia. And the Nixon-Eisenhower administration, where Nixon was vice president, but Eisenhower had a lot of health issues, so a lot of times it was Nixon in the driver's seat. They weren't doing anything about it. I mean, the Mafia could assassinate the Attorney General-elect of the state of Alabama, who was elected on an anti-Mafia platform, and they just killed him right after the primary, which in those days was the election because it was all Democratic. And were those assassins ever, convicted? No. And that was Marcello and Traficante had a hand in that. So the Mafia could assassinate the president of Guatemala, as they did in 1957, get away with it. So the Mafia had their run of America, and it was John and Robert Kennedy who finally stood up and said, Senator Kennedy and his chief counsel, Robert Kennedy, that we're not going to take this. And they started by going after the head of the Teamsters Union, Dave Beck. Of course, he was replaced by a guy by the name of Jimmy Hoffa, you've probably heard of. Yeah. And then they went to Hoffa's associates, like Carlos Marcello. And so the Mafia was incredibly big. There were huge Nixon supporters. All the stuff you've ever heard, and I document this in the book, about the Chicago Mafia giving Nixon the election and everything. That's just bogus. Political scientists have looked into that. Think about it for a minute. A Democratic president who's good friends with the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Daley, the most powerful politician in America at the time, a Democratic presidential candidate does not need the Mafia's help to carry Chicago. I mean, that was true in 1960. It's true today. The Mafia was giving huge support to Richard Nixon. They were giving like $1 million bribe from Giancana, Carlos Marcello, Santo Traficante. The Mafia was going to kill Fidel Castro right before the 1960 election. That was Nixon's idea, and Nixon ordered the Mafia to ordered the CIA to work with those mob guys. But the big surprise was, well, first, Castro didn't get killed. Second was that when the Kennedys were elected, it turns out going after the Mafia was not an empty campaign promise. They really went after the Mafia. In fact, they went after the Mafia harder than any anyone had ever done before or has since. I mean, they didn't just double or triple the mafia prosecutors at the federal level or the times in grand juries. I mean, we're talking 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 times the terrible efforts that Nixon had made to not go after the mafia. So, but they specifically targeted, people like Carlos Marcello, like Santo Trafficante, like the Chicago Mafia. So the mafia basically had their backs against the wall, and there are wiretaps. Now, Marcello was not wiretapped, Trafficante wasn't, but some mobsters were, and you can hear on these federal wiretaps, that Kennedy finally made the FBI go after the mafia. Their backs were up against the wall. They were saying somebody should, kill this family. I mean, because they didn't have Cuba to run to anymore. When Senator Kennedy, before the election, tried to go after Santo Trafficante just ran to Cuba and hid, and used people like Jack Ruby as a go-between to take messages. So there was no Cuba to go to anymore. Kennedy's Justice Department, this is big articles in the New York Times. You can see this before JFK was killed. They were getting ready to go into Las Vegas and run the mafia out of Las Vegas. So the mafia no longer had Cuba. The mafia was getting ready to be run out of Las Vegas. Carlos Marcello was on trial with federal prosecution in New Orleans, and I've talked to that federal prosecutor. I mean, and he wasn't even a citizen. Roselli was not a citizen. One small conviction gets those guys deported. Marcello had already been kind of illegally deported early in JFK's administration, and then had to sneak his way back into the country. So, like I say, these mobsters had nothing to lose and everything to gain by killing JFK, and not just killing JFK, but killing JFK before that December 1st coup. Because despite the Kennedy's best efforts, the mafia had infiltrated the coup plan. And it's shocking. I mean, most historians had never heard anything about that coup plan until I played a behind-the-scenes role to get some of those files released in the 90s. But there are mobsters who worked for Trafficante and Marcello talking about these plans in print to the FBI and even in the newspaper, in a conservative magazine, back in 1963 and 64. And so you ask yourself, these are the most secret documents of the federal government, most of which are still not been released. How is it the mafia knows? Well, they infiltrated that plan because they knew if they could put links between this secret coup plan and JFK's murder, if they could kill JFK the same way that Commander Almeida had planned to kill Fidel, which was in an open car during a motorcade, that would cause, shock and awe among the highest U.S. officials, including Robert Kennedy. And, there would have to be a cover-up, and indeed there was. And it's no coincidence that Trafficante, Marcello, and Roselli, the two godfathers in the Mafia Dawn, not only did they confess their roles in JFK's murder, they had been working on the CIA Mafia plots to kill Fidel since 1960. So they were CIA assets. The CIA was going to have to cover up as much of that contact with those guys as they could. And that's exactly what happened. So there were just so many cover-ups, for good reasons to protect Commander Almeida, for bad reasons to protect intelligence failures. John and Robert Kennedy did not know in 1963 that the CIA, as they eventually admitted, were still using some of these very mobsters to go after Castro. What the CIA thought those mobsters were doing in an attempt to kill Fidel, the mobsters were actually using those very things to kill JFK. And thus you can't say, I think it's the Oliver Stone movie, there's some line in the movie, which is a good movie, but I mean, it's not great history, but it's a good movie. That basically says, well, look who benefited, look who's behind the cover-up. But you can't just look at who's behind the cover-up. Tom and I, we kept Commander Almeida's name secret for almost, for 20 years. We weren't part of the conspiracy that killed JFK, but we didn't want to see Commander Almeida and his family killed because we prematurely linked his identity. And so you've got that going on literally starting the day JFK was killed.
Interesting. Yeah. And Operation Mongoose, Operation, what was it, 40 with E. Howard Hunt, I believe he was a part of the Watergate, and also he had a deathbed confession.
Well, and again, you have to look at all these confessions. When I say people like Marcello Traficante and Roselli have made credible confessions, I did work in the criminal justice system early in my counseling career, oddly enough, in the state of Georgia. So I've taken one law course, and so I'm not a lawyer. If you want a lawyer, Gerald Posner was a Wall Street lawyer. There are a lot of lawyers, but you when you look at credible confessions, a credible confession, is not made for money, and it's made with the expectation that it will never be made public. Because otherwise, there's no statute of limitations on murder. Why on earth would you confess to murder when there is no statute of limitations, and the government's already after you? Well, you do it if you're admitting it to your attorney, like Traficante or Roselli, or in the case of Carlos Marcello, if you have a trusted cellmate with you, who's your closest friend in federal prison. The Kennedys could never put Marcello in prison, but he's finally in prison by the mid-1980s. And if you trust your roommate, and you're Marcello, and you run the prison, you can look at everybody's prison records, and you think that this guy is safe, and he wasn't even a career criminal. He's just one guy with a bad day, just an ordinary guy. Yeah, you'll mention that to your trusted friend. But in the case of E. Howard Hunt, his confession has to be taken with a grain of salt for three gigantic reasons. Number one, it basically is apparently kind of cobbled together from a lot of earlier information in books, including information about Corsican assassins that has been long discredited and was very publicly discredited in the late 80s. There was a documentary, The Men Who Killed Kennedy, that came out and it named the three Corsican assassins, and then it turns out all three of those guys had alibis. They were just fed a line of BS. That was in the British version. And anybody can look that up. So Corsican assassins, nothing to do with JFK's murder. Sure, there was a French assassin deported from Dallas the day after the assassination. I write a lot about that, but he was not Corsican. The second thing is E. Howard Hunt's best friend in the world, Manuel Artemi, Cuban exile leader, a doctor, a leader of the Bay of Pigs, who had been captured, put in Castro's prisons, got out right at the end of '62, early '63, thanks to Robert Kennedy and Kennedy's top Cuban exile aide, Harry Enrique Ruiz Williams, who liked to be called Harry Williams. Manuel Artemi was E. Howard Hunt's best friend for the rest of his life. Manuel Artemi was working on the JFK Almeida coup plan, as was E. Howard Hunt. But Manuel Artemi, as well documented now, was also working for Santo Traficante in narcotics trafficking. E. Howard Hunt's assistant since the fall of 1960, when Hunt was basically given a role in the CIA Mafia plots. This is before Kennedy was elected. E. Howard Hunt was assigned Bernard Barker as his personal assistant, because Barker, as we now know from the FBI, this was kept out of all the Watergate stuff, but we now have the document that shows the FBI was fully aware Barker had been Mafia since the late 40s and was working for Traficante in 1960. Traficante, part of the CIA Mafia plot. So you make a Traficante low-level gangster and CIA agent Hunt's assistant. They remain close for decades to come. E. Howard Hunt never mentions the fact that his best friend, Artemi, and his top assistant, aide, Barker, were working for the Mafia, specifically Santo Traficante, in his confession. You'll notice E. Howard Hunt does not mention the Tampa attempt at all, which is now very well documented, thanks to the work Tom and I did. So you have to ask yourself, so was Hunt really being forthcoming, or, as Rolling Stone, I think, pretty well documented, Hunt was looking for a big payday from the star of Oliver Stone's film to to Kevin Costner, developed a great interest in the JFK assassination after he starred, in the partially fictionalized role of Jim Garrison in the JFK film by Oliver Stone. Hunt was looking for a big payday, was looking for millions of dollars. So if you're looking for millions of dollars, you make a confession that has no basis in fact, that's based on some old discredited information about Corsican assassins, and you leave out any information about your own mafia ties through your best friend, through your aide, and you don't mention things like the Tampa attempt. I mean, Hunt could have been the first guy to reveal to the world the Tampa attempt. Why didn't he do that? Because, who knows if Hunt was involved. And Hunt, by the way, did not admit being involved. He basically said they told him about it and he backed out of it, or he just wanted to stay on the sidelines. The fact is, Bernard Barker was involved in JFK's murder. Bernard Barker testified under oath that he saw, he was watching when JFK's head was blown off and saw that happen. He testified under oath to Congress that's true. Now, JFK's assassination was not broadcast live anywhere in the world, including Miami, where Barker claims he saw it on television. There are two independent witnesses, one in law enforcement, that placed Barker on the grassy knoll, the famous grassy knoll in Dallas, where at least 2 shots were fired. So, was Barker involved? I mean, people who work close with John and Margaret Kennedy told me, yes, Barker was involved. Barker was working on the JFK Almeida coup plan in '63 as Hunt's assistant. Hunt was a big deal in the coup plan. We did not know. The Kennedy people told me that Bernard Barker was also working for Santo Trafficante. In other words, Barker was selling out the coup plan to his real boss, which wasn't the CIA, which wasn't Hunt, but was Santo Trafficante. And that's how so many, half a dozen, Mafia people came to learn about and work on this coup plan that the Kennedys thought was totally secure and safe from the Mafia. So E. Howard Hunt, like I say, if he had been the first to reveal the Tampa attempt, if he had owned up about the Mafia ties of his best friend and his assistant, I would view his confession much more credibly, especially if it didn't include already discredited information about these fictitious Corsican assassins, but he didn't do that. So, could Hunt have been involved? Sure. Could he have been sold out by Bernard Barker, his assistant? Sure. Would the CIA files, those million CIA records, not pages, but records, so it could be millions of pages, could they shed more light on this? Undoubtedly. And so when you wonder why the CIA is still keeping these records secret, and the law says anything that the CIA has kept back has got to be released in 2017, but thanks to a lawsuit filed by Jefferson Morley, a former Washington Post reporter, we know from a filing the CIA has said 2017 when all the files are supposed to be released, nah, we might not do that. We'll keep them secret past 2017. So this is why that's the big secret the CIA is hiding. Not that the high-level people at the CIA, who were very loyal to John Kennedy, killed JFK, but yeah, there are people in the CIA, I think it was very clear soon after JFK's murder, within weeks or months, if not days, that there was some involvement by CIA people. And that's what the CIA is hiding, that they had these plots to kill Fidel, hatched under Nixon, were being withheld from JFK. They briefly found out about him a year earlier, but told they were stopped, but they weren't, and the CIA admits that now. Manuel Artemi, part of the CIA Mafia plot. So you start to see a pattern here. All of the CIA people that were definitely involved, Bernard Barker, one of the Watergate burglars, Hunt's assistant, a guy by the name of David Morales, a kind of a mid-level CIA supervisor in Miami for covert operations, and John Martino, a CIA asset, who confessed late in life and who talked in print about the coup plan years ago, I mean decades ago. Yeah, those three guys were definitely involved. Could Hunt have been involved? Perhaps. Could William Harvey, a disgraced CIA official who had been a big part of Operation Mongoose to go after Fidel in 1962? Could he have been involved? I had a former CIA guy tell me that was possible. Could David Atlee Phillips, another one of Hunt's friends in the CIA, could he have been involved? It's possible. But that's why we need those CIA records, because, I think the CIA would definitely rather put those guys out to dry than ever be blamed officially for JFK's murder. But that's why they're keeping those files secret.
Yeah, I mean, even Oswald's tax returns won't. I mean, obviously they're saying for security reasons, like the excuse they use for anything they want to keep classified.
Right. But just think of the expense reports from Hunt and Barker for 1963, and for Morales. Just the and the CIA is the kind of agency that does have to keep these things secret. They have to keep accounts and balance books and stuff. So yeah, just if we even had the expense reports for Barker, Hunt, Morales, and the other ones, so there's 3 definite CIA people who were involved, 3 other ones who might have been involved, including Hunt. But yeah, if we just had their expense reports, let alone their actual reports and files, and that's why there's so many pages still secret. I mean, one part, Artemis part of the JFK Almeida coup plan was called AM World, a word that you will not see in any government investigation book, anything, magazine article until my first JFK book, because I learned about that in the early 90s from the people who worked on it. And then a great researcher by the name of John Newman, former military intelligence and history professor at the University of Maryland, he actually showed me this document that says, so what's this AM World stuff? And I said, yeah, that's part of the JFK Almeida coup plan, but, AM World alone was, estimates vary, $26 million plan. There are probably hundreds of thousands of AM World pages alone, and that was just part of the JFK Almeida coup plan. So they even paid Almeida. He got $500,000 as a down payment in case the coup didn't work and he died. His family would have that money, and they were under CIA protection from a distance in a third country, not the U.S., not Cuba, but apparently on a medical treatment pretext. They were in some country where the CIA had their eye on them, which also means if Almeida had kind of double-crossed the U.S., we kind of had his family. But yeah, there was a payoff, and Hunt and Barker coordinated that payoff. So Hunt and Barker knew everything about the JFK Almeida coup plan because the CIA had assigned Hunt to be the liaison between the CIA and Robert Kennedy's top Cuban aide, Harry Williams.
Well, let's break down one of the most important parts of this whole thing, or at least one of the most intriguing, and that's the fact that somebody actually got this on film, the Zapruder film. And what's your take on? Obviously, there's some people who say the film took years to be released because it was tampered with. Also, what's your opinion on where the gunshots came from? And obviously, did Oswald even shoot a one shot, or was he framed? Did he actually, was he a shooter and was just involved in this whole thing, or was he?
Well, let's keep track. So there's 3 questions. There's the Zapruder film.
Yeah.
Where the evidence shows the shots really came from, and did Oswald even fire a shot? Okay, so we got 3 questions. So first question, Zapruder film. Yeah, it's been analyzed up one side and down the other. And I was in Dallas at one of the JFK conferences when a guy named Raleigh Zaveda, who is a big film photographic expert, was hired by the 6th government committee to investigate the JFK assassination. That was the Assassination Records and Review Board. So remember, there wasn't one government committee that investigated JFK's murder, the Warren Commission. That was the first of 6 committees. The last congressional committee, the House Select Committee, they're the ones who concluded JFK was killed by a conspiracy and that Marcello and Trafficante had the motive and the means and the opportunity to have done it. But the 6th government committee was that Assassination Records and Review Board. Raleigh Zavada was one of the people they used to verify the authenticity of the Zapruder film. And I was at a convention in Dallas, and Zaveda was there. And there were people in the audience, including authors, who have written that the the film was faked and this and that and the other. And he basically did a great explanation of why that was impossible. And I believed him because I did amateur movie making. Like in that movie Super 8, I used to make amateur films by the late 60s. And I tried to do special, and I learned about special effects. I mean, I was a big fan of people like Ray Harryhausen and Douglas Trumbull, all the big special effects geniuses. And I, got to meet some of them later and have long talks. So I knew a lot about film special effects at a pretty young age. And I knew that what the Zapruder film fakers say happened would have been impossible in the late 60s, and it was really, really impossible in 1963. But so Rolly Zaveda, distinguished gentleman, impeccable credentials, he was there, and he said, look, I've done my presentation. Ask me any question you want. All of you people who think it was faked in any way or altered, put me on the spot. See if you can ask a question I can't deal with. And no one could. I mean, even though there were big doubters there, they could not raise it because his presentation was so good and thorough. He is in the best JFK documentary ever made, was made by German public television, never translated into English. It's got people like Senator Ted Kennedy. Can you imagine him being in a U.S. assassination documentary? It's got Gore Vidal. I'm in it. Other people are in it. The best computer recreations. Rolly Zavada was in that and explained why the Zapruder film. I mean, I think the Zapruder film very clearly shows a conspiracy. So it's the last thing in the world you'd want to, fake something that proves a conspiracy.
Why do you think it was not released for so many years? Why do you think that it took so many years before they finally televised
I'll ask you this. So how long was it? So World War II started for much of the world, some of the world, back in 39, and was going great guns in 40, and we didn't get in until December 7th, 1941, that date that Russ kept stressing to me. How long do you think it was before the first picture of a dead American serviceman appeared in the U.S. press?
No idea.
I think it was 1943. And there were a lot of dead U.S. servicemen, starting the first day of the war. But, that was just not done. And even then, it was a big deal and not a common thing. It was a big deal.
But there's a lot
when the first photograph was published. If you go back to the mainstream press, I'll ask you this question. What was the first time any mainstream press referred to Jack Ruby as having ties to the Mafia?
Oh, I'm not sure.
Nowadays when I talk to young people, they would assume, what would it be, days, weeks, months, years? No, it was, I believe, around 1977.
Wow.
In other words, it was 14 years, and Ruby was not only mobbed up to his gills, Carlos Marcello's organization owned the Carousel Club, Ruby's nightclub in Dallas. They owned that. Ruby only managed it. He'd been caught stealing from the till because Marcello's had great financial people. Marcello was not educated at all, but he had great money people because millions of dollars every week was flowing through his organization. They had to be hidden from the feds. They knew almost to the dollar what a club like Ruby's would be taking in at what time of the year. They caught him stealing. That's why Ruby was called to Marcello's huge 1,000+ acre estate outside of New Orleans, and basically said, you're gonna take care of the patsy or you're dead. It's just pretty simple, and you'll do that. So first off, let's clear the Zapruder film, because you got two more questions I need to answer. So Zapruder film, totally authentic, clearly proves conspiracy to me. As far as where the shots came from, Dave Powers was one of JFK's top aides since the start of JFK's political career. He and Kenny O'Donnell were in the limo right behind JFK, so they had the best view of everything, of JFK, of the grassy knoll, of everything. And Dave Powers told Tom Hartman, while Dave Powers was head of the JFK library, and Tom was sitting in one of JFK's rocking chairs, in Dave Powers' office at the JFK Library, Dave Powers looked at Tom and said, yeah, we saw and heard the first shot came from the knoll, and the last shot came from the knoll. And he and Kenny O'Donnell were just as certain of that as anything, because they'd both been in, World War II and everything. And get this, you can go to any library, big library in the country, look up Tip O'Neill's autobiography, Man of the House, published in the 1980s. And Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House much of the 1980s. He was a big guy. He was famous. He was the most powerful member of Congress. And in his autobiography in the 1980s, Powers and O'Donnell tell him the same thing. Yep. First shot came from the knoll, and then the last shot, definitely conspiracy. And so the first shot that hits JFK in the throat, definitely came from the front, from the knoll. The last shot that blew off JFK's head, as the Zapruder film clearly shows, and Powers and O'Donnell told Tip O'Neill, and Powers told Tom, when I had Tom interview Powers, that came from the front. There were at least, I would think, 2 shots from the back, one which missed the limo entirely, and the other that apparently hit JFK in the back. So that's where the shots come from. And by the way, as I say, I believe it's in chapter 2 of the Hidden History of the JFK Assassination, the single bullet theory is just that, a theory. It's completely impossible. When Discovery Channel tried to recreate it, they tried to gloss over this. I believe they were doing it in Australia or someplace, and they had one of the better recreations ever, with human-sized dummies and that sort of thing. Any shot that would hit JFK where he was really shot in the back, and he was shot in the back, not the back of his neck, would have come out like around his heart. No way it comes out in the throat. JFK was shot almost 6 inches below his collar in the back, and there's not only a wound, but there's the holes in his jacket. And you see computer recreations by people who believe the lone nut theory, and JFK looks really distorted, or his coat is hiked up so much it's almost they're trying to explain why in his coat the wound is almost 6 inches below the collar. On his body and the autopsy there's a wound. So you can't have a shot coming down at the steep angle from the Schoolbook Depository, enter his back almost 6 inches below his collar, and then somehow it rises up and comes out his neck and then dives back down. So that's impossible. And then thirdly, Oswald, there's tremendous amount of evidence now, and there was at the time, that Oswald was where he said he was, down in the lunchroom on the first floor, which is also where there's a payphone. And so if you wanted to have Oswald in a place where he could be blamed for the assassination, you would pretty much know that everybody in that building is either going to be at a window or is going to be outside, probably outside. Oswald, oddly enough, wasn't. The Warren Commission investigator counsel, David Bellin, did a secret memo. You won't find this in the Warren Commission report, but it is in the volumes, the 26 supporting volumes. Bellin outlined that it looked like Oswald was planning to go to Mexico City and to try to get back into Cuba. So it's very clear to me Oswald thought he was going to defect to Cuba, just like his phony defection to Russia, for naval intelligence and the CIA, that he was supposed to make or receive a phone call at the payphone. He was told to stay close to that payphone. When the first cop and the supervisor truly rush in, Oswald is there near the Coke machine. There's a woman on the stairs. That you would have had to have seen Oswald coming down the stairs, but there's already somebody on the stairs. So there's 2 witnesses there. So Oswald, all the evidence points to Oswald being exactly where he said he was, which was alone in that lunchroom, very close to the payphone. And of course, the Mafia is great about using, payphones. Because in those days, they were pretty much impossible to trace. And Oswald, according to the Warren Commission version, was some sort of a teenage communist, and that's the only motivation the Warren Commission could ever come up with is that he was crazy, except there's really no evidence of that, so he must have been a teenage communist. But ask yourself, and your listeners can do this too, how many teenage communists do you know that in the McCarthy-Nixon 50s, the ultra-conservative 50s, how many teenage communists were trying to join the Civil Air Patrol? Not only joined the Civil Air Patrol, loved it, and then not only joined the Civil Air Patrol, but then not only joined the U.S. Marines, but tried to join the U.S. Marines before they were even old enough. And then once they were in the Marines, they went around spouting a love of Russia and Russian so much that his own Marine buddies called him Oswaldskevich. And yet, guess how many times Oswald's, drill sergeant or the officers on the base ever disciplined Oswald for spouting this love of America's hated enemy?
How many?
Exactly zero. I mean, exactly zero. So it's just ludicrous. So Oswald was one of 6 young men who went. A great journalist by the name of Dick Russell documented this. Oswald, one of 6 young men that went to the Soviet Union around the same time, supposed defectors. 5 of them all returned around the same time with Russian wives, because the goal there was, Oswald even told people he was in the Marines with, when he was at our secret U-2 base in Atsugi, Japan, he told fellow Marines he was working for naval intelligence. And so
when he spoke fluent Russian, and his wife, I know, mentioned that she thought he was Russian because his Russian was so good, and he came back.
And Russian is one of the, I'm terrible at foreign languages, but Russian is way harder to learn than Spanish. I couldn't learn Spanish, but Russian is one of the most difficult languages, and he supposedly taught himself fluent Russian and went around spouting Russian to his Marine buddies. I mean, he was working for U.S. intelligence. He was his job was, like these other young men, go over to Russia, stay a while, learn what you can, come back with a Russian wife. Then, as I document in the hidden history of the JFK assassination, naval intelligence, with the help of the CIA, then put Oswald and his wife under tight surveillance. And by tight, we mean visual, phone intercepts, mail intercepts, but from a distance. Okay, so the surveillance was not obvious. They wanted to see how the KGB would then try to recruit Oswald or these other fake defectors once they were back in America. That would let them roll up, find out a lot about the KGB and eventually, sting those people and arrest them. That's why, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we all thought we were going to be blown up, Oswald, who was a very public defector, there were newspaper articles when he defected and when he came back. So you got this former defector with a Russian wife in the conservative city in Dallas, and at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's able to get a job at the firm in Dallas that does top secret work for the U.S. government, making maps from the U-2 spy plane photos that were then being taken in, over Cuba. So whenever you see old clips from the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you've got JFK or Dean Rusk or the Secretary of the UN, and they have these big poster-like things with the U-2 photos and everything's labeled, those maps were prepared by the firm in Dallas that this former defector was working on, which makes no sense except naval intelligence and the CIA. They wanted to make Oswald a more attractive target for recruitment. So that's why he got a job at such a super sensitive facility at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the Russians, they were always dubious of Oswald, and probably these other young men too, and they never bit. So that's why Oswald was kind of adrift. Here you had this deep cover agent, and we do know Oswald planned to eventually reveal himself. We have the notes for that. The Warren Commission had the notes, didn't know what to make of them, where he was going to do his big reveal and show that, he was actually just like his favorite TV show when he was a kid, I Led 3 Lives. He was, seemingly this former defector, but, he was really working for the U.S. government the whole time. So normal guy on the surface, former defector, but really working for the U.S. government, he was susceptible to being manipulated by two people working for Carlos Marcello in New Orleans. Guy Bannister, the former head of the Chicago Mafia, who'd been heavy drinker and had to leave the FBI, but was Marcello's private detective, and Marcello's pilot, David Ferry, they both did work for the CIA. Guy Bannister was almost part of the CIA Mafia plots. There's a CIA memo about that we now have from the summer of 1960. And David Ferry, according to the assistant for later CIA Director Richard Helms, was a CIA agent and asset. So Oswald thought he was getting his orders from the CIA or Naval Intelligence. Guy Bannister also did work for Naval Intelligence. In reality, they were just manipulating him on behalf of Carlos Marcello. So Oswald thinks on the day of the assassination, he's, going to leave work around, sometime after lunch, and he's going to go meet his contact at the Texas Theater, and then he's going to get to go down to Mexico City and then on into Cuba in support of some upcoming big U.S. operation. He wouldn't know any details about the JFK Almeida coup plan, but he would know something was in the works, and he would be told he's going to do this. Put yourself in the position of a U.S. soldier on the eve of D-Day back in World War II. Okay, let's say you're a soldier. D-Day is coming up 3 days later, or 5 days later, or the next week. You're arrested erroneously on some charge, some serious charge, maybe that you killed some English person over a girl or something. Are you, as a U.S. serviceman who knows the entire fate of World War II and the lives of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people depend on you keeping D-Day a secret, are you going to keep D-Day a secret for a few days, or are you going to say, no, I couldn't have killed this Englishman because I was really doing the secret training for D-Day when we're going to invade Germany next week? No, if you're a good soldier, and I think Oswald was, you're going to keep that secret. So that's why Oswald isn't blurting out saying, he does say, someone needs to come forward to help me, but, he's not going to blow the fact that he's a deep cover U.S. intelligence asset. He's been deep cover since 1959. He thinks this is all a big misunderstanding and is going to blow over, though I think with every passing day, he probably realized also the position he was in. David Ferry's name surfaced in association with Oswald in Dallas, and newsmen were told, as I document in the book, that you can't mention David Ferry's name for the good of the country. U.S. intelligence was saying that. And U.S. intelligence probably thought David Ferry was, still working for them, that he was getting ready to help with the Castro operation. We know now, David Ferry, he was working for the CIA, but, his real boss was Carlos Marcello. Yeah. So, did that answer all three of your questions? It
did.
Just want to make sure.
And also, the reason the Zapruder film, the thing that seems interesting, I guess the best piece of evidence that there might be some tampering with it. I know there was some company out of California that got from the archives a negative of it, and they said that, of course, I'm sure there's no actual evidence or proof, but their opinion that they think that it was there was a slight chance it was tampered with. But there's a lot of witnesses who said that they saw JFK's car slow down or possibly even stop right before he got shot. Have you seen any accounts of that? Any credible witnesses?
Well, again, go back to the account I mentioned of Dave Powers and Kenny O'Donnell. You don't have to take my word. Like I say, you can take the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill's word. It's in his book, but Powers went into more detail with Tom. Powers said, look, the first shot definitely, he said, the first shot and the last shot, the first shot that hit JFK and the last shot that blew his head off definitely came from the front, from the grassy knoll area, undoubtedly, okay? And so Powers addressed that point with Tom. Powers said, look, the driver of the limo, who, by the way, was not one of the guys partying at Ruby's friend's club, drinking hard liquor until the wee hours of the morning. The driver, was not one of those people. So the driver, he was in pretty good shape. So Powers told Tom, he said, look, the driver's gotten a lot of unfair criticism over the years that he slowed down when the shooting started. But Powers says, of course you're going to slow down if you think you're driving into an ambush and people are shooting at you from the front. You don't want to hit, your instinctive reaction is to put on the brakes so you don't get closer to the shooting. So so the limo slowed undoubtedly. And Greer, the limo driver, he slowed down because I think he was pretty aware too that those shots were coming from the front, and you don't want to, that is what you should do. If you think you're being shot at from the front, you're going to put on the brakes.
I guess you could make the argument, because I guess everybody's a little different, but I would make the argument that if I was being shot at, first instinct before really thinking about it would be hitting the gas to the bottom and trying to get the hell out of there.
But no, remember, if you hear and see the shot coming at you from the front, and when you look how early JFK was shot, that grassy knoll is, like I say, Powers and O'Donnell, they had the perfect view not only of JFK but of the grassy knoll. That grassy knoll is definitely in front of you, and I hear what you're saying. And perhaps I would say, yes, some laymen would do that. They would drive into the shooting, even though people are shooting at you from the front.
Well, can we be positive?
But I think any kind of a trained person, as Greer was, you are trained not to take the person you are charged with protecting. You're not going to take them into closer danger.
But can you be? How are you sure he knew where the shooting was coming from?
If Powers and O'Donnell are sure the shots are coming from the front, Greer is even closer to those shots than Powers and O'Donnell. They were in the limo right behind JFK. So Greer is in the perfect, he's even closer to those shots. So,
but hasn't some witnesses said that they saw it slow down before the first shot?
I have never seen any evidence for that at all. And I can tell you something else too. For people who try to say, there are now people who try to say, even people that used to be big lone nut people that try to say, okay, yeah, Marcello confessed, yeah, there's a mountain of evidence that he and Trafficani and Roselli were involved, but Marcello just hired Oswald to do it, which is stupid on two counts. One, the Mafia didn't get away with 1,000 murders in Chicago of never being convicted, which is basically a statistic that came from Guy Bannister, who was the head of the FBI in Chicago, by hiring amateurs to do professional hits. That's not how the Mafia gets away with murders. When Bobby was holding hearings in Washington on organized crime and Trafficani in particular, Trafficani had somebody killed the day before just to thumb his nose at Bobby, and you're not going to hire an amateur for that. So the same thing is true in Dallas and Chicago and Tampa. You're not going to hire an amateur like Oswald. The other thing, if Oswald was the only shooter, when that limo was coming down the street toward the school book depository, then it does have to almost come to a stop right below the school book depository to make that turn. That would have been like shooting fish in a barrel, because Oswald was a terrible shot. Even when he practiced in the Marines, he would sometimes miss not just the bullseye, but the entire target. So, like I say, Oswald, he didn't do that shot. That Powers was just so definitive, and said to Tom, the driver has gotten a bum rap because Powers said he would have hit the brakes if he had been driving. And like I say, Greer was even closer to those shots. So whatever let Powers know those shots were coming from the front, both the sound or the flash or whatever. And I'm not saying there was a flash, but like I say, Powers was just, and he was a combat veteran, he was just certain, no question, that first shot came from the front. But like I said, there's no evidence that the braking occurred before. There had been braking earlier when that turn was being made, but the limo was starting to gain speed.
Is that
and
why
then Greer hits the brakes at the first shot.
Did you see? Have you ever seen the video on YouTube of the Secret Service agent jumping off before that final turn?
Oh, you mean at the airport?
No, it was right before the final stretch. A Secret Service agent was on the back bumper, like basically the vehicle had this bumper that was kind of like a little platform, and then had these things that kind of looked like spoilers, which were handles which the Secret Service agents would hold on to and be basically human shields. And then before the last turn, there's a video. I don't know how old it is or when it really started picking up a lot of views and people start noticing it, but there's a video of a Secret Service agent. It looks like somebody's telling him to get off, and he jumps off.
I think you're confusing two things. There is a well-known video when they're at the airport, and there's an agent taking up a position at the rear, and then he is called off. And a lot of people say, well, that's clear sign of a conspiracy.
And he shrugs. Maybe.
Yeah,
okay.
No, but see, that's at the airport, and they were going at pretty high speed at parts of that trip. So no, you would not want somebody on the limo, there. So again, I just have to say, while the Secret Service, while many of Kennedy's detail did a horrible thing by going out drinking till the wee hours of the morning and partying with some of Jack Ruby's strippers, they didn't know they were Jack Ruby's strippers. At Ruby's Friends Club in Fort Worth, there is not a scintilla of evidence that the Secret Service had anything to do with JFK's assassination. But, because of the heavy drinking, finding out some basic information from those agents was not a difficult task. But there was really no inside information that needed to be had, really, because things like the motorcade route were very public, and there's stuff about the motorcade route supposedly being changed, and Bill Moyers, but like I say, all that stuff really just kind of falls apart when you look at it closely. So Secret Service did not distinguish themselves that day or the night before, but they didn't have anything to do with JFK's murder, and they were on the limo when JFK was doing his motorcade in Tampa. Jackie was not with JFK. The chief of police, as he told me himself, had advised JFK to cancel that motorcade because there were at least 2 assailants at large. And there were several turns, including one just like the one in Dallas, in front of the tallest hotel in Tampa that looks very much like a taller version of the School Book Depository. Every window open. They couldn't, close out every room. It was just terrible. But JFK went ahead with it. He did have the agents on the back of the limo then. But you have to remember, so they had big threat in Chicago. JFK cancels not only motorcade, but entire trip. Big threat in Tampa. JFK goes ahead with the motorcade because he has to give a speech that night with words written for Commander Almeida, where JFK kind of promises his support, so he can't very well, say, I'm afraid to do my motorcade in Tampa, but you should overthrow Fidel for me. So he goes ahead with the motorcade. Jackie's not with him, but there are Secret Service agents on the limo in Tampa. But by Dallas, there was no known active threat in Dallas, and that's why the Secret Service agents let their hair down and went out drinking until 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, because, the pressure was off. So there was not an active threat, so that's why there were not agents on the back of JFK's limo in Dallas as there was in Tampa. Plus, the whole deal was, let's show how JFK and Yarborough and LBJ are all good buddies and all working together, and why you should vote for us all in November.
Well, I know Abraham Baldwin, I had him on, I think it was around the same time all the press was coming out about Secret Service agents today still doing similar things, drinking and partying. And,
exactly the same things.
But he also said that back then there's a lot of other Secret Service agents that he obviously wasn't a huge fan of because they would show. He took his job very seriously. And
they would show up drunk. Some of them were extremely racist.
Well, that's what he also said, that some of them didn't like JFK because of his likability in the black community, and called him a nigger lover and all this stuff. And this is right from Abraham Baldwin, and I mean, which I guess doesn't prove that they were involved or they let something happen.
Because like I say, there is no one's ever been able to point out to me any reason the Secret Service would have had to be involved, and again, there's not a scintilla of evidence that any Secret Service agent, J. Edgar Hoover, LBJ, George Bush Sr., there's just no evidence against those people, whereas in contrast, one of Robert Kennedy's own Justice Department prosecutors, after reading my second book, said that there was enough evidence to have taken Marcello to trial and have convicted him. I mean, of course, this is by, the 2000s. A lot of that evidence wasn't known, and he hadn't made his confession back in '63. But, so like I said, there's a mountain of credible evidence. I mean, admissible evidence, credible confessions, not made like hunts for money or that leave out important information. I mean, when Marcello told that informant, Jack Van Lanningham, in prison, when Van Lanningham, just an ordinary guy, a successful businessman, family man who had kind of, been on an alcoholic spiral, so he had one bad day and tried to rob a bank with a bag of dirty laundry and a TV remote control and felt so guilty he turned himself in the next day, and he got this hard sentence, and he winds up in prison with Marcello because they're the closest in age. Most of the prisoners, were in their 20s. Marcello was in his 70s, and then Van Lanningham, was much closer to Marcello's age than anybody else. So they wind up as cellmates. The FBI pressures Van Lanningham to become an informant, and Marcello just, he blurts out his main JFK confession in the yard in front of Van Lanningham, only Van Lanningham and another trusted associate from New Orleans. And then in their cell, later on, once Van Lanningham has a bugging device in the cell recording Marcello's every word, Marcello's talking about Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald. And Marcello said there, I own the Carousel Club. And this is on tape, the FBI won't release. I own that club. Ruby was working for me, we caught him stealing. Well, I thought, that can't be true. The FBI must have looked into who owned the Carousel Club. That's a pretty obvious thing, right? And the FBI is good at that kind of financial stuff. Well, there's a lot of credibility for that, because when I looked back, the FBI found one guy had loaned Ruby the equivalent of, I think it's $150,000, the owner of a barbecue shack in Dallas, was a 50% owner of the Carousel Club, and he had loaned Ruby the modern equivalent of, I think it's around $150,000, which how does the owner of a barbecue shack get $150,000 to loan to Ruby when Ruby's already owes him money? That makes no sense. The FBI was never able to figure out, even on paper, who owned the other 50% of Ruby's club. So Marcello's confessions are full of things like that, where he said things that are in FBI files from the 1980s, which we can now verify that were not known by anybody. So that's the kind of credible. So when I talk about credible confessions, that's the kind of things I'm talking about. So like I say, we've got a mountain of evidence against those mob bosses and at least 3 mid to lower CIA level people. No evidence, no credible evidence against Bush, LBJ, Hoover, or the Secret Service.
Yeah, and there was a link between Oswald and Jack Ruby. I don't know if you read the book Me and Lee by Judith Baker.
Unfortunately, she's been widely discredited. So one reason I've been lucky or able to get on CNN, MSNBC, have a couple Discovery Channel specials, been in that great German special along with Ted Kennedy and Gore Vidal, is that I never cite, if somebody's been discredited at all, I don't use them, and so again, Judith Baker, widely discredited, and so I there's so much. This is the sad fact. When you look at only the extremely credible information that actually has supporting information, like Marcello's confession, the ownership of the Carousel Club, he wasn't BSing his cellmate. It turns out, he did own it. They fronted part of it through the barbecue shack owner, and the other part of it they just had. But when you look at only the credible evidence, you don't wind up with a giant, sprawling conspiracy with a lot of unanswered questions. When you look at the credible evidence, you wind up, in confessions, you wind up with a very small, tightly held conspiracy where everybody involved is doing things they had actually done before. You know, JFK wasn't the first time Marcello and Trafficante and the Mafia killed a president and blamed it on a seemingly lone communist nut. They did that in 1957 in Guatemala. You know, when the president that the CIA had installed a few years earlier was assassinated because he wouldn't go along with the Mafia gambling casinos, and they assassinated him, and the supposedly lone communist assassin was quickly assassinated himself. You know, so we have all these situations where it was a small, tightly held conspiracy. Oddly enough, only a dozen people in the U.S. government really knew about Commander Almeida and the coup plan. You know, some people knew parts of it, but Commander Almeida's name was super secret. No one wanted that to ever come out because he was never going to reveal he was ever working for JFK. It was always supposed to appear as if a lone communist or communist sympathizer had killed Fidel, and then Almeida had rallied the country and locked down all of the Russians because he knew where they all were because he was the head of the Cuban army that housed them. And, you know, and then Almeida would invite U.S. troops in to keep the Russians from trying to take over. But it would never be known that Commander Almeida was secretly doing all this for the United States. So when you've got those kind of secrets that have to stay secret for so long, and I just remembered one earlier question you had asked, because I try to pride myself on answering everybody's questions. You had said before, why didn't Robert Kennedy want the identities of his killers to come out? Why would not he have wanted that? And it's very important for your listeners to know that. So Bobby Kennedy and his brother were leading this big war against organized crime. And like I said, they were having hearings about Trafficante in Tampa that fall. You know, it's like I said, Trafficante had somebody killed the day before the hearings just to snub his nose because he knew, you know, he could get away with it. Robert, and in those hearings, Robert Kennedy has people testify, and Robert Kennedy himself says that it's almost impossible to ever convict a godfather or a high mafia leader of having anybody killed, because there are so many levels and layers of insulation. And the way they do, like in Tampa, they bring in assassins from out of town, they have no connection, they kill the person, and then they leave. But the godfather, you know, his fingerprints are never going to be on the money, there's never going to be a paper trail, they're never going to meet with people unless they're sure there's no government surveillance. So Robert Kennedy had said himself, it is pretty much impossible to ever convict a mob leader of doing, you know, even the most basic kind of hit, let alone a high-profile hit. So Robert Kennedy knew, I believe Robert Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy said, and this gets left out of an awful lot of books, Robert Kennedy said, he told Richard Goodwin, by 1967, Robert Kennedy had done at least 2 secret investigations of his own. And he told Richard Goodwin that the mob guy in New Orleans, meaning Carlos Marcello, had killed his brother. But Robert Kennedy knew they were already trying to get Marcello for, you know, much lesser crimes. And they were having trouble doing that. And Marcello bribed a juror for that trial he was on in November 63, and he got off. Then they tried him for bribing a juror. He got off of that. So, you know, but he wasn't a citizen. So the pressure, you know, Bobby knew the way to get to Marcello is, you know, convict him of anything, and then you can deport him. But that's going to be the best you can probably ever do, because, you know, you couldn't have convicted Marcello for any of the many hits he'd ever committed, let alone the JFK hit. So Bobby knew what he was up against. He also knew that Commander Almeida was still in place, you know, and that, you know, if he said too much, everything could unravel. I mean, if he ever mentioned the Tampa attempt in public, that would have been front page news and would have just been everything. When the Jim Garrison investigation happened, which started with bringing in David Ferry, you'll notice David Ferrie is not linked with Carlos Marcello in all of that news coverage, even though David Ferrie was sitting with Carlos Marcello the day JFK was shot, when Marcello was waiting on the verdict of his trial, his federal trial in New Orleans. And I talked to Bobby's prosecutor, who was in that courtroom, and he noted and thought it was odd, David Ferrie had been with Carlos Marcello that entire trial, but after the break, and when they came back from having heard about JFK being shot, they took a break, they came back, that prosecutor said he thought it was unusual that David Ferrie wasn't there. Because now we know that David Ferrie's library card was discovered on Oswald when Oswald was arrested. And so David Ferrie had quite a lot of stuff to do, and I document his weird trip in the middle of the night to Houston and basically how that card got from Oswald's wallet back to David Ferrie's hands. But David Ferrie even admitted when he was finally interviewed by the Secret Service, because most people don't even think anybody was ever interviewed, but there were a lot of suspects, including Ferrie. Ferrie admitted to Secret Service agents that, when they said, now, did you ever say that somebody should hide in the bushes and shoot JFK? And David Ferrie said, yeah, I probably said that. And then an investigator for Jim Garrison found a sheet after David Ferrie's death, sudden death, at the height of the Jim Garrison hysteria, when Marcello's name still was not being linked to Ferrie, where Ferrie had apparently ejected shells from a rifle like a Mannlicher Carcano to see how far an ejected shell would go. Clearly, so shells could be planted. So, like I said, tons of evidence against people. Marcello and David Ferrie, they spent the 2 weekends before JFK's murder together on Marcello's big, multiple, more than 1,000-acre estate outside of New Orleans.
Now, there was a link between Jack Ruby and Oswald. I think a really interesting thing was the video of Jack Ruby admitting that there was basically a conspiracy, and it went to the highest levels. And I think that was another piece that some people like to mention that has something to do with possibly.
Do you know who one of Jack Ruby's first visitors was after he shot Oswald?
Who was it?
It was the Marcello's #1 lieutenant in Dallas was a guy by the name of Joe Campisi, who owned a great Italian restaurant that's still there. Joe Campisi's dead. I bumped into him at that restaurant. A great restaurant in Dallas, but it's got like side photographs in one room, like from Al Pacino to Joe Campisi saying from one godfather to another. But so Marcello's #1 man in Dallas, Joe Campisi, was one of Ruby's first visitors. And you can imagine what that conversation was like, correct? Later on, Jack Ruby told, I believe it was a psychiatrist, that he had nightmares, that his family, because he had a sister, he had niece, nephews, that kind of thing, and he had brother, were being dismembered and burned alive. So I have no doubt he had those nightmares, because that's what Joe Campisi told him. And in fact, there was a member of the Chicago Mafia, an associate of Johnny Roselli, who specialized in dismembering and burning his victims alive. So Ruby, he knew his life depended on him shutting up. Now, your listeners should know this. So Ruby was kept in a cell that reportedly overlooked Dealey Plaza, which is a great thing if you want to be sure somebody stays quiet. You make sure they can see every day the place where the Mafia, your bosses, like Marcello, got away with killing the President of the United States. Ruby's trial, and by the way, Ruby's lawyer threw the trial and then went to Mexico and got a big payoff. So Ruby's lawyer threw the trial. Ruby should have only gotten 2 or 3 years, because in Dallas, to protect oil men who kill the lovers of their wives, there's like a sudden passion defense, where you can say, I just suddenly went crazy, and sometimes you even just get probation. That's what Ruby thought he would get. His lawyer threw the case intentionally, got a big payoff in Mexico right after that. But Ruby clearly, his trial was, when you talk about pretrial publicity, there has never been pretrial publicity anywhere like there was in America, but especially in Dallas. So Ruby's conviction was overturned for pretrial publicity, and he was going to be moved to, I think it was Wichita Falls, or Wichita, one of those, way away from Dallas. And he would no longer be overlooking Dealey Plaza, would no longer be under the control of the pretty corrupt Dallas police or sheriff's department. He had just had a physical where he was pronounced totally fit. Suddenly, he comes down just weeks after his physical, maybe even 1 week, with a sudden case of cancer that kills him in no time flat.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It seems like they're just taken out.
The only faster acting case of cancer like that I can think of is when one of the Senate and House investigators, Gate and Fonzie, wanted to talk to Manuel Artemi, who was involved with the coup plan, E. Howard Hunt's best friend, also working for Santo Trafficante. And he suddenly came down with cancer, and before he could officially testify, he died real quickly too.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I have even known seasoned government investigators. I won't identify them because I can't remember if this was on the record or off, but I've had seasoned, respected, former Justice Department government investigators tell me that they thought Ruby's death, occurring as it did, was just so bizarre. But yeah, I mean, Ruby was between a rock and a hard place. He was going to die, his family was going to die painfully and slow,
And him and Oswald, they did know each other, right?
Well, again, all the evidence that claims that doesn't hold up. I mean, did they pass in the night? Not pass in the night, but were they in some diner together? Like I say, nothing really holds up. Whereas, on the other hand, there were at least congressional investigators found 6, if not 7, witnesses that totally confirmed that David Ferry and Oswald were together just months before the assassination, and that Oswald was basically working for Guy Bannister. And so, people try to make these connections that don't really fit, like Oswald and Ruby. Could they have met? Sure. Is there a glimmer of recognition on Oswald's part right before Ruby shoots him? Oswald's own brother said that, but I've looked at that tape 100 times since I saw it when I was a kid, and sometimes you may see it, sometimes you don't. But so the important thing is not to look at the things for which there is no evidence. I mean, look and see if you can find evidence, fine. But if you can't, look where there is evidence. So like I say, there's no doubt that Ferry and Bannister and Oswald, even the CIA admits, they all knew each other. And it's very clear Oswald thought he was working for them on behalf of naval intelligence and the CIA, but their real loyalty was to Carlos Marcella.
And he was interrogated for also, 12 hours without an attorney, and there's no record of that interrogation?
Well, think of this, too. So Earl Warren is the head of the Warren Commission, and Jack Ruby was alive at that time. Jack Ruby's appeal could have gone all the way to Supreme Court. So how terrible was it for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to be on the Warren Commission when Jack Ruby is still facing trial? And what happens if his appeal goes to the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice has to excuse himself, so there can't be a ruling one way or the other because there's an even, But again, the Warren Commission was not about finding the truth. It was about reassuring America that there didn't need to be World War III because the Russians and the Cubans were not involved. That's what the Warren Commission was about. And like I say, Ruby is a great guy to look into. I mean, here's a guy who was vacationing with the chief of police in Dallas in the late 50s, who even a Dallas policeman said was the payoff man for the Dallas police. Like I say, Ruby is a real Ruby was carrying messages from Marcello to Trafficante when Trafficante was hiding out in Cuba in 1959, and to give himself cover, Ruby became an FBI informant for a while to give himself cover for that. Ruby was seen, as I document, I got this from Pierre Salinger, JFK's press secretary, Ruby was seen getting an envelope full of money in a hotel in Chicago, Bismarck Hotel, shortly before the Chicago attempt. Ruby was from Chicago. Ruby probably would have had the same role of silencing the patsy in Chicago, only in that case it would have been a different ex-Marine, that he had in Dallas. Ruby went to Tampa sometimes to look for strippers. Ruby was based in Tampa during World War II. And so, again, Ruby, so it's not like you had three different plans. You had one plan with the same people, some of the same kinds of patsies. Ruby probably would have had the same roles that he had there, but get this. Ruby disappeared during the time of the JFK assassination. He had been at the newspaper office, and then he disappeared. So no one, with one exception, sees Ruby from a good bit before the assassination until a good bit after. A later mayor of Dallas, incredible guy, swears he saw Ruby near the Texas School Book Depository just before the assassination, actually right at the time of the assassination. That later mayor of Dallas was in the press bus, which was several cars behind JFK's limo. And this guy, later mayor of Dallas, says, yeah, I saw Ruby. He was right near the School Book Depository. We know that afternoon, Ruby did have a gun with him, a pistol, and he had pretty much the exact sum of money he had gotten in Chicago. It was approximately $7,000, I think, in cash, because he was seen at a bank later that afternoon. So as I have a lot of facts in the history of the JFK assassination, but here's a bit of speculation, and I identify it as such. Apparently, Ruby was near the School Book Depository at the time of JFK's murder with $7,000 in cash that he'd gotten in Chicago from an associate of Jimmy Hoffa and a pistol. And so, very likely, what was supposed to happen, you and I would not be having this conversation today if right after the assassination, when Oswald had left that building, Ruby had created a disturbance and said, this guy's trying to rob me, and so I had to shoot him. Because, look, I've got all this cash on me. I have a cash business. I have a nightclub. This crazy guy came out of the School Book Depository. He had a wild look on his face. I thought he was coming to rob me, so I pulled out my gun and shot him. That's probably what was supposed to happen. You know, Oswald was probably never supposed to get away from the School Book Depository. But, you know, as we know, he did. And he went to the Texas Theater, where he didn't just go in. There's a lot of evidence he bought a ticket, went in, he sat next to at least two different people before getting up and moving to somebody else. He was clearly looking for his contact. Somebody had the other half of the item he had to match. And then he went outside to look to see if his contact was outside. And we know this because John Martino, the CIA asset who was actually working for Traficante, said Oswald was supposed to meet his contact at the Texas Theater, where Oswald thought he was then going to get to Mexico City and on into Cuba. Then Oswald goes back inside the theater. That's when the ticket taker thought he had gone in without buying a ticket, even though he had the money to buy one. But the concession guy's like, no, this guy bought a ticket, you know. And then guess how many people in the theater the Warren Commission or the police interviewed after Oswald's capture?
None, right?
Bingo.
Yeah.
You would think, but of course, you know, get this, when the lights come up, the police don't go right to Oswald. They go, it's kind of funny, you know, Oswald went to sit beside different people looking for his contact. The police don't go right to Oswald. They go to somebody else first because they wanted Oswald to run, because if he ran, they could shoot him, and he'd be dead. And you and I would not be having this conversation.
So to wrap this all up, why do you think this story is still so important? And also, well, I guess the backtrack, that my first question should be, why do you think, what was the biggest reason to why they had to take out JFK? What were they worried about?
Well, first off, so I'll answer both questions. I'll answer the secrecy second. First off, Carlos Marcello, godfather of Texas and Louisiana, Sancho Traficante of Tampa, and Johnny Rouleau of the Chicago Mafia, they had no choice. They literally had no choice. Remember, Marcello and Roselli are not even citizens. The smallest conviction gets them deported, and Marcello had a horrible time when the Kennedys had sort of extra legally deported him not long after they took office, and he wound up literally in the jungles of Central America in his, Gucci loafers, swearing eternal vengeance against John and Robert Kennedy. So Marcelo didn't want that to happen again. I mean, you're powerful as a godfather, but once you're outside the country, that's a different story. Your grasp becomes much more tenuous. So they had no choice. Marcelo was on trial. If the Kennedys lost that trial, they were going to try him again, as they did. Traficante's own family was being prosecuted, and they were sure going hard after Traficante. The police chief before, the one that I talked to, had reportedly been in the pocket of Traficante, but now Tampa had a police chief that was totally against Traficante. So, that was a deadly combination. And then Roselli's Chicago Mafia, he worked for Sam Giancana, even though Roselli himself is based in Los Angeles and Las Vegas. And Sam Giancana was under pressure, heavy pressure from the Kennedys. So those three gentlemen, as I said before, they had nothing to lose by trying to kill JFK and everything to gain, because they were probably all going to get convicted or deported or both. And, the Mafia is a ruthless organization. Once you're in prison or once you're permanently in another country, your power and the safety of your friends and family become questionable. So those guys, that's why they had to do it. Remember, before December the 1st, they couldn't wait. That's why they didn't do one plan. That's why they didn't have one backup plan. They had a main plan for Chicago and two backup plans, because this thing had to work, because that was really their last chance before the coup plan. And they knew that the coup plan, because they had infiltrated it through people like John Martino and Guy Bannister and David Ferry and of course Bernard Barker. They knew this coup plan was so secret that so much would have to be covered up that's why they had to kill JFK when they did, and they had to go through things in Dallas. And the plan had not leaked in Dallas as it had in Tampa and Chicago. So that was your first question. I think your second question is, why does this still fascinate people? And I can tell you, it's because the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, and Naval Intelligence have been covering up so much for so long, and I don't think they'll release everything even in 2017, and people should get really worked up about this. Whoever you support for president, if you ever get a chance to meet them, I don't know if you have listeners in Iowa or New Hampshire, but if you do, there's a good chance they could actually meet a president, and they should say, look, there's a law that says all the JFK assassination files should be released. Not only have they not all been released, the National Archives won't even say how many files are still secret. Do you support releasing all these files? It's been over 50 years. That should be the litmus test for whether or not you're going to vote for your candidate or not. And people need to get the mainstream media interested. Starting February the 1st at the hidden history of thejfkassassination.com, I hope to have a link to a White House petition. Again, I've tried this before. I got almost 1,000 signatures once, but you need a lot more than that, to release all the JFK files and to pardon the framed ex-Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden. Sad case there. Bolden was totally framed. The Secret Service is still doing the heavy drinking and all the other scandalous stuff like they were back then, and they get away with it because they're keeping all these files secret. So, we need to pardon Bolden, and we need to get those files released. And starting on February the 1st, if people go to the hidden history of thejfkassassination.com, hopefully I'll have a link to a White House petition to try to get that happening.
Yeah, when Bolden was on, I was also trying to advertise that petition, and yeah, we should really do our best, because he is a historic figure. There's no reason why he should have a record on his hands, and he should really have his name cleared. So yeah, I'm glad that people are doing their best to try to do that. He's such a delightful person to listen to and talk to, and very insightful. And,
a great American civil rights hero. And the reason I'm doing it February the 1st, that's Black History Month. I can think of no greater living black historical figure who is such a hero and a pioneer that people just don't even know about, let alone this tremendous injustice. And I know there's that recent documentary about the Avery guy and the murder, and people trying to get him a petition for a pardon, but he wasn't even convicted of a federal crime, and he has a lot of shady stuff in his background. I mean, here's Bolden, the squeakiest clean person you could ever want to know, who's been totally forthcoming. And I've read files going back to the 60s that one of his lawyers, Bernard Finsterwald, had, and it's just amazing. But he did they kept him out of most of the Chicago investigation for the Chicago attempt, but of course, as an agent there, he was aware of things and saw people, and so there are definitely things that the Secret Service and the CIA and the FBI didn't want the public to know. And so when the Mafia framed him, and I even described exactly who framed him, the half brother of the guy who framed him said, "Yeah, my half brother Richard Kane, Riccardo Scalziti, the made member of the Mafia, who was the chief investigator for the Cook County Chicago Sheriff's Department. Yeah, he had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. Kane had worked, with people like Trafficante and Roselli. Kane was part of those CIA Mafia plots under Barker and Hunt. So yeah, we even know who framed Bolden and why. And then Bolden, the judge was totally biased, and there were these secret meetings between the judge and the prosecutors, and Bolden's main accuser admitted he committed perjury on the orders of somebody in the district attorney's office. It's just ridiculous. So you can tell I feel very strongly about that, but to call attention to Bolden's case since 1993 in public, even before my books came out. So, but like I say, February the 1st, going to start a new petition. I'll be sure to let you know about it.
Absolutely.
If your listeners want to check the hidden history of the JFKassassination.com, February the 1st. Hey, I'm not getting any younger. None of us are. And do we want to see, a million CIA records stay secret? They shouldn't be secret now. They're probably not going to be released in 2017. And it's naval intelligence and FBI. Let's hear Marcello's own words. The informant said he was clear as a bell. The one FBI, I talked to two of the FBI people involved. One of them heard every tape and said, "No, I never heard any sign that Marcello was remotely senile or anything." That wasn't until several years later. Marcello was completely focused. But yeah, let's hear those tapes. Let people judge for themselves. Let's hear Marcello himself talking about Ruby and Oswald. But the law says those tapes should be public, but the FBI, they hid them from the Assassination Records Review Board in the 90s until right before the board folded, and then they were just kind of dumped there, and I was the first person to ever find all those uncensored files. But what I've got are just the tip of the iceberg. Let's hear those tapes before something happens to them.
Absolutely. And you know what, even though a lot of those people, or some of them are gone or can't be accountable, I think it's important to show the public and to show the world that, hey, sooner or later, people who are responsible for such a crime their names will be out, and history will remember them as as the villains that they are, and for what they've done. So and I think it's important because, like you said, everybody talks about this recent documentary on Netflix, Making a Murderer, which is very good, and it shows corruption and all that stuff and all that juicy stuff that people love. But this stuff has been happening forever. I just had Ray McGovern on, and we talked about, he worked for CIA and became an activist, and
right.
And there's tons of secretive things going on. And he was telling me about how he found out about the Chile coup while he was working for the CIA, doing morning briefings for the president, and he read about it in a newspaper. So it shows how not everybody who works for the CIA knows what's going on, and not everybody's responsible for these things. But
speaking of newspapers, when you've gone through hundreds of thousands of pages of CIA, FBI files like me, you pretty much know what's in them. And there are a lot of newspaper clippings, that the CIA and the FBI, they keep tabs on a lot of stuff, Guess how many copies of that Tampa Tribune article about the Tampa attempt that came out the day after JFK's murder? Because by that time, the Tampa police chief was like, okay, all bets are off. JFK is dead now. We got to let people know. Guess how many copies of that article have ever turned up in CIA, FBI, or Secret Service files?
No idea.
None. Zero. Zip.
Wow.
They got that article because the next day AP tried to follow up, and then people had been talked to, and the chief of police was like, nope, can't say anything. Nobody said, and so, they're very aware of that. When I looked at the Tampa FBI field office file for the Tampa office for November of '63, there was barely a mention that JFK even went to Tampa. And we know from the chief of police, the FBI was called in because, it was all hands on deck, even though the Secret Service is responsible. They don't have nearly the resources in Tampa that the FBI did. So the FBI had a big role in trying to protect JFK. You would never know that from the Tampa field office file, but they were so busy pulling that stuff out and pulling out stuff about the Tampa suspect, similar to Oswald, they left in the raw wiretap transcripts of a friend of the Tampa suspect. And I've got to say, if the FBI was bugging the phones of just an associate, not even a close associate of the Tampa suspect, you better believe, everybody who ever came within a million miles of Oswald probably had their phone bugged after the assassination too. We don't have those files. Not that I necessarily think we should, but because it was creepy reading these raw wiretap transcripts. That was just creepy. But the FBI's just covered up so much, and they're all covering stuff up. So let's get out. And I realize there are other people out there that believe different things about the assassination than I do, most of whom haven't seen all the evidence I outline in all my thousands of pages. But, I'm willing, put all the information out there. I'll let the chips fall wherever they may. I'm real sure they're only going to provide more corroboration for what I've been saying, because I try to be careful with what I say. But, let's just get all the files out there.
And I think just sparking these conversations are important. And as long as people, their incentive is just trying to spark this conversation and exposing what they think might be getting closer to the truth, then I'm okay with that. I mean, people sometimes will look at the same information and have different theories on what it means or what it leads up to. So, we talked briefly about Russ Baker and Roger Stone, and I've had Jesse Ventura on, who's done a JFK book also, and there's a lot of theories on certain things that don't match up. But I think the one thing I can say about all you guys, that you guys are trying to take information, and I don't think anybody is as thorough as you, especially after this conversation. You can see that you've done your homework, and after years and years and looking into this, you definitely emphasize stuff that you have proof to put out there, and you have proof to back up, and you're not just putting out a bunch of things that you're just connecting dots. And I definitely appreciate that. And I think that that's one thing I love about your books, and I love about hearing you in interviews and stuff like that, is just you're very well researched, and you really don't connect dots, and you just, everything that you talk about, you have evidence to back up. And I think that's very important to keep people talking about this, and realizing that it's not just a bunch of conspiracy theorists who are just trying to make things up, but there's a lot of solid evidence and proving that there's a bigger plan, and there's much more to than what the Warren Commission testifies said happened. So thank you so much, Lamar. I really appreciate your knowledge and information. I'll definitely have to have you on later to
I was going to say, I really appreciate the opportunity. And if after this episode airs, you have listeners that email you or send you questions that we haven't dealt with, by all means, save them. In fact, I'll make that challenge to listeners right now, friendly challenge. If you've got questions or points you don't think I have addressed, they're probably addressed in my books, but even if you don't want to read the short book that's only 500 pages, send you those questions, and next time you have me on, we will answer every single one of them.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Absolutely. And I'll put links in the video notes. I always put links to the website and any of your work, so I'll have links to your book and to your...
And again, people should, let me make 2 points. So one, people should know right now there's not a whole lot at the hidden history of the JFKassassination.com, but that's going to be really revitalized on February 1st. So definitely mark that on your calendar to look at the hidden history of the JFKassassination.com on February the 1st. And on my books, as much as I benefit a little bit more if you buy the hardback, generally with my books you always want to buy the trade paperback, because like the first book is radically updated, Ultimate Sacrifice. I mean, that's like the biggest, but that's where it was first written to hide Almeida's identity, and then rewritten to expose it. But all my books have some extra material ranging from a little to a ton in the trade paperbacks. So they're both cheaper and, like I say, you always get the most up-to-date information. But all the most up-to-date information is in The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination.
Awesome. Thanks, Lamar. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you don't get too much snow in the next 48 hours. And hopefully I don't either, because even though I'm used to the snow, I definitely don't enjoy shoveling it anymore. But
let's hope. I wouldn't mind seeing a mild dusting just so it's kind of white and the roads are nice.
Yeah, it's like pretty for the first couple hours. It's really pretty until like salt and everything else.
As long as I wake up tomorrow and it's all gone, that's fine.
Thanks, Lamar. I really appreciate it. I'll have to have you all also on to talk about Watergate, because you have a really interesting book about Watergate that I think most people don't know about.
It ties a lot into the JFK assassination. Not that Nixon had anything to do with JFK's murder, but as we've talked, Bernard Barker, one of the Watergate burglars, definitely did, and E. Howard Hunt might have. And some of the other Watergate burglars have, I have to say, been unfairly tarred. Virgilio Gonzalez, nothing to do with JFK's murder. Eugene R. Martinez, nothing to do with JFK's murder. McCord, nothing to do with killing JFK. Now, all the Watergate burglars, plus their handlers like Hunt, were involved in the CIA Mafia plots. So that's G. Gordon Liddy had nothing to do with any of that stuff, which is why he says he didn't even know what was going on. But yeah, so a lot of those guys were involved in the CIA Mafia plots, but only definitely Bernard Barker had anything to do with JFK's actual murder. But yeah, lot to talk about with Nixon and the Mafia, and again, that's one big reason so much has been kept secret for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Lamar. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you still have time to hit up the grocery store, and I'll talk to you soon. We'll keep in touch, and I'll send you links to the show and everything once it's up and live.
Sounds great. Thanks so much.
Awesome, Lamar. Thank you. Really appreciate your time.